Imagine taking a short, quiet walk on a bright afternoon just a single mile away from a safe, busy police station. You are doing nothing out of the ordinary, perhaps just heading home or going to meet a friend. You make a quick, split-second decision to step inside a car, believing you are safe, but that single decision erases you from the face of the earth. There is no struggle, no scream, and no clues left behind. Just an empty road and a family whose lives are shattered in an instant. This is exactly what happened to a young woman named Cherita Thomas in the year 1980. She was a vibrant young person with dreams and a routine that she followed every single day. She was loved by her family, and she had no reason to run away. But on that quiet day, she was walking down a road in northern Michigan. She was close to the local police station, a place where she should have been safe. An older man pulled up next to her in his car. He offered her a ride, and for reasons we will never fully know, she got in. The car drove off, blending into the normal flow of traffic, and Cherita was never seen alive again. For over 20 years, this mystery hung over the small community like a heavy, suffocating fog. It was a case that deeply haunted a local police officer named Sergeant Alan McGregor. He had worked out of that very police station, and the fact that a young woman had disappeared so close to his office without a trace was something he simply could not accept. In the days and weeks after Cherita disappeared, the police worked tirelessly to find out what had happened to her. They followed every lead and interviewed everyone who had been in the area that day. Soon, their investigation led them to an older man named Jimmy Nelson. Based on tips from the community and several circumstantial clues, the investigators became nearly certain that Jimmy was the man who had picked Cherita up on the side of the road. Their theory was dark and straightforward. They believed Jimmy had driven her to a remote area, murdered her shortly after picking her up, and then hidden her body in a particular section of the Huron National Forest. The Huron National Forest is a massive, sprawling nature preserve in northern Michigan. It covers thousands of acres of dense woods, thick brush, and swampy terrain. It is the kind of place where something could remain hidden forever if you did not know exactly where to look. But the problem was that the police did not have any actual evidence that supported this theory. Their case against Jimmy was entirely circumstantial. In fact, they did not even know if Cherita had really been murdered because for the last 20-plus years, they had searched that particular section of the Huron National Forest. They had gotten the FBI involved. They had chased down every lead. Yet still, they had not found Cherita's body. So, they really did not know what happened. For 21 years, the dense canopy of the Huron National Forest remained a silent vault. Every single expedition returned empty-handed, and the local community began to lose hope. But McGregor kept a map of the forest pinned to his wall, staring at the green vastness every night. He knew that the forest held the truth, but it was simply too massive for human eyes to scan alone. They needed something more. But as Sergeant McGregor neared the forest, he hoped that today would be the day that all changed. On the morning of the 30th of August 2001, Sergeant McGregor drove with his partner, Officer Mark David, towards the Huron National Forest. The two of them were on the way to this forest to meet with a very unlikely detective who McGregor believed might actually be the key to solving a case that had haunted him for the last 21 years. He pulled up by the entrance of the Huron National Forest, and he and his partner got their first look at their unlikely detective they were here to meet. And this detective was a Doberman Pinscher mix with big floppy ears who was lying on the ground and panting and wagging his tail. His name was Eagle, and he did not look like a stereotypical police dog because he was not a police dog. However, Eagle was the best crime scene sniffing dog in the entire world. His trainer, a 40-year-old woman named Sandra Anderson, was standing right beside him. Now, Sandra and Eagle were very famous in law enforcement circles, and so Sergeant McGregor and his partner were already well aware of their backstory. Sandra had actually adopted Eagle from a pound shortly before he likely would have been euthanized. And then after she adopted him, Sandra, who had made a career in teaching dogs how to sniff for cadavers, just sort of naturally on her off time, began training Eagle how to do it too. And amazingly, Eagle really took to it better than police dogs did. Sandra claimed that Eagle possessed a unique sensitivity to the chemical compounds of human bones, allowing him to easily bypass animal remains and other distractions. Her phone was constantly ringing with requests from across the country. Whenever a high-profile case went cold, prosecutors and sheriff departments looked to Sandra and her famous Doberman mix to find what they could not. Now, any good police cadaver dog could sniff out hidden objects and track a scent for miles, and Eagle could definitely do that. But also, Eagle could do things that the police cadaver dogs simply could not. Like, he could smell blood that had been cleaned with bleach and also painted over. I mean, that is like a superpower. No dog could do that, but Eagle could. One forensic anthropologist who had come in contact with Eagle and seen what he could do firsthand said that, if a great cadaver dog was rated a 10 out of 10, well, Eagle was like a 20 out of 10. He was far and away the best of the best. And so Sergeant McGregor believed that if Charita's body really was in that section of the Huron National Forest, well, Eagle would be able to find it. Sergeant McGregor was excited to see Eagle in action. But after he and his partner parked, they walked over and spent a minute, petting Eagle because Sandra said it was fine. And they gave him some pets, and Eagle really liked it, and he sort of rubbed up against them. But then at some point, Eagle just kind of stopped and looked towards the entrance of the National Forest like he was ready to go. At which point, Sandra said that he was ready to work. So Sergeant McGregor and his partner followed behind Sandra and Eagle as they led the way into the forest towards the section where they had been told to search. Once they reached that section, McGregor and his partner kind of stayed back on the fringes and just watched Eagle work, and it was incredible. Now, McGregor and his partner had seen police dogs work before, so they were familiar with basically the pace at which these dogs would find something, which often, it would take some time. But basically, as soon as they got to this clearing, they are watching Eagle, and he is sort of walking around sniffing, looking for something. But then suddenly, he stopped, turned, and made a beeline towards this tree. And when he got there, he began pawing at the ground like he had found something. Sandra, his trainer, kneeled down next to him to see what Eagle had found. And she saw, as he continued to dig, that there was something in the ground. And so she called out to McGregor and his partner, and they came rushing over. And sure enough, Eagle had found a human bone fragment. To be clear, this dog only finds human bones. And so it is not like he would be able to find a chicken bone and think it was a human bone. Basically, if he found a bone, it is a human bone. McGregor and his partner were totally shocked here. I mean, they had really high hopes for the search, but to already be finding human remains in this particular section of the forest was revolutionary. I mean, not only was it a big deal to find human remains here, but these could be Charita's. This could be the key to unlocking this 2 decades-old case. But Sandra, Eagle's trainer, did not seem shocked at all. This was pretty much par for the course. She smiled at the 2 investigators and kind of shrugged like, yep, this is what he does. She gave him a treat, and then Eagle got up and just continued searching the area. After Sandra and Eagle had taken off, McGregor and his partner bagged the bone fragment and then just kind of continued to let Eagle do his work. And over the course of that day, Eagle just kept on finding more human bones. It was truly incredible. And then the next day, when they came back for a second search, Eagle found even more. It was like there were human bones all over the place. However, this was actually kind of typical for human remains that have been left out in the wild for a long time, like they believed Charita's had been. The idea is, after the body is left there and decomposes, animals come along and break apart the bones and kind of carry them in different directions. There is weather, there's a bunch of things that affect the body that sort of gradually takes it and spreads it all over the place. But as alarming as it was to find this many human bone fragments in such a small area in this forest, at the end of that second search on the second day, McGregor, all he could feel was elation. He felt like Eagle had done the exact thing he was hoping he would do. He had found the remains that very likely were Charita Thomas's. McGregor thanked Sandra and Eagle profusely for their help. And then, after saying bye to them, He and his partner went back to the station, and they sent off the bone fragments to the FBI to be analyzed. And then after sending them off, they waited. The analysis would take several months, but in February of 2002, the FBI finally called McGregor. Now, at this point, McGregor was very hopeful and sort of expected that these bone fragments would belong to Charita. But what they actually said shocked him because according to the FBI, those bone fragments that Eagle had dug up did not belong to Charita. In fact, the bone fragments did not even belong to a single person. They belonged to 3 different people. And when McGregor heard this, his blood ran cold because he was not thinking, oh boy, this totally blows up the case. Instead, he is thinking, I bet Charita is out in that forest. We just have not found her yet, and if we keep using Eagle, we will find her. But now I have at least 3 more people that have been found out there. 3 dead people. So maybe Jimmy is way worse than I thought he was. Maybe he did not just kill Charita. Maybe he is a serial killer, and he is dumping his bodies in that part of the forest. However, as explosive as this new information was, it only made things way more complicated for McGregor because he and his partner and all of his colleagues had no idea who these 3 new bodies were. And neither did the FBI. The FBI could only determine that these bone fragments came from 3 different people, but who they were, they did not know. And so to try to figure out who these 3 people were, Sergeant McGregor would need to find more clues. The FBI agents who processed the DNA were deeply unsettled. They had to double-check their results multiple times because they could not believe that a simple search for one missing person had suddenly uncovered a potential burial site for multiple individuals. When McGregor received the news, he sat at his desk in silence, feeling a heavy mixture of horror and determination. If there were 3 other victims out there, he had to find them. And to find more clues, he needed Eagle to go back to the forest and keep on looking. And so he immediately reached out to Sandra, who said that she and Eagle would come back out there and search the forest again. The new search began on the 17th of April, 2002. McGregor, his partner Sandra, Eagle, and a whole bunch of police officers and crime lab technicians descended once again on that same section of the Huron National Forest. But after a kind of lengthy search that day, the police officers, the entire police force that showed up, they did not find anything of note. But Eagle, he did. At some point, Eagle had sniffed out a human knuckle bone in a dried-out stream bed. When this discovery was made, Sergeant McGregor was elated because it was like, once again, we are finding evidence that is going to help him break this case. He has been trying to crack for 20 years, which now might actually be way bigger than he thought it was. It might not just be the murder of Charita. This might be the hunting grounds or the dumping grounds of a serial killer who killed Charita Thomas. And he, McGregor, was going to be the one who solved it. He just knew it. But when McGregor turned back around to continue searching in the area that he was looking, he suddenly heard this commotion coming from behind him, sort of in the same direction where that human knucklebone had been found. And he turns around and he sees what looks to be some sort of physical altercation happening amongst 2 people. He cannot really tell who it is, but there is screaming happening. It is total chaos. And so, having no idea what was going on, McGregor abandoned his search, turned and ran to go break it up. And after this fight was broken up, another major discovery was made. But it was not another bone. It would turn out the person who was dumping bodies in this section of the Huron National Forest was not a serial killer, nor was it Jimmy Nelson. Instead, the real culprit was actually one of the investigators who was out here doing the search right now. Eagle was not the world's greatest cadaver-sniffing dog. In fact, Eagle was not even a cadaver-sniffing dog at all. And his trainer, Sandra, was well aware of that because this was all a big act. It would turn out when Sandra and her dog were called out to a site to perform a search, Sandra would show up with a stash of human bones tucked into her clothing right up against her skin. And then, once the search began, she would discreetly pull little bone fragments out and drop them on the ground in front of Eagle, who would immediately notice them and alert people to them, making it seem like Sandra and her dog had once again saved the day. Sandra did this dozens of times across dozens of searches all over the country, all because she loved the thrill of watching the police discover her crimes in real time. Sandra had been successfully searching for body parts that she herself had planted for years without anybody being remotely suspicious of her. The investigation into Sandra's background revealed a highly calculated routine of deception. She had built connections with medical labs and research facilities, using her credentials to quietly walk away with bone samples. She would keep these pieces in small jars at home, choosing specific fragments for each search to match the age and profile of the victim she was pretending to find. She was playing a dangerous, thrill-seeking game. However, during the search for Charita Thomas, Sandra got caught. Right before that fight broke out on that last search, Sandra and her dog had stepped off to the side and believed nobody was watching them. And Sandra bent down and pulled a bone fragment out of her sock and was about to place it, but then realized a crime lab technician was clearly watching her. She had been caught, and so the crime lab technician went up to Sandra to call her out on it. And Sandra, who knew she was caught, began to panic and pretended that she was being attacked by the crime lab technician and made a whole scene about it. That is what McGregor heard when he turned around and wondered if there was a fight going on. There was no fight. It was just Sandra again being caught red-handed. But as awful as Sandra's actions sound, she did not actually kill anyone. Instead, during her years-long run of fraudulent searching, she had been stealing pieces of medical center cadavers and using those. Sandra ultimately pleaded guilty to multiple felonies, including falsifying evidence and obstruction of justice. And so she was sentenced to 21 months in prison. After she was caught, the FBI had to go back and reevaluate 50 murder cases that Sandra and Eagle had been involved in. Luckily, though, during this examination, they discovered that in all of these cases, they did not hinge on evidence that Sandra had found, and so there were no convictions that were overturned. As for Jimmy Nelson, he was eventually convicted of Charita's murder. However, his conviction was overturned, but it had nothing to do with Sandra and Eagle. The evidence used to overturn it was completely separate. And so to this day, we still do not know what happened to Charita, and her body has still not been found. As for Eagle, nobody was mad at him, and he retired from working crime scenes and got as many treats as he wanted until he passed away peacefully in 2003. The mystery of what happened on that country road remains a dark shadow in northern Michigan. The family of Charita Thomas looks at the quiet forest, wondering if the truth will ever finally surface, completely free from the complex web of lies that once derailed their hope. They are left with only the precious memories of a vibrant young woman who stepped into a car and vanished, leaving behind a haunting story of a search that was tragically broken by human greed, while the quiet woods keep their secrets. More than 20 years later, the forest still has not given up its final secret. And perhaps the most disturbing part of this entire story is that the biggest lie was never hidden in the woods. It was standing beside the investigators the whole time. If you want to watch more true crime stories with twists just like this one, check out the next video on the channel. Thanks for watching. See you next time. If you search for the most unbelievable war stories in history, there is one particular name that almost always appears at the very top of the list. It is a story of survival, determination, and a complete refusal to die, even when the human body has been pushed far past its absolute limits. To understand how this incredible story unfolded, we have to go back to South Texas in the year 1935. This was the year that a boy named Roy Benavidez was born. Roy did not have an easy childhood. When he was still a very young child, he lost both of his parents and became an orphan. He was sent to live with his uncle, and the family struggled constantly just to make ends meet. Times were incredibly tough, and by the time Roy was a young teenager, he had to make the difficult decision to drop out of school so he could work in the local beet and cotton fields. He spent long, grueling hours doing hard physical labor just to help support his family. But as the years went by, Roy knew he wanted something more out of life. He wanted to see the world and do something bigger. So, when he turned 18 years old, he decided to enlist in the United States Army. Shortly after joining, he volunteered for airborne school and was eventually assigned to the famous 82nd Airborne Division. Roy loved the Army. It was his entire life, and he was incredibly proud of his service. In October of 1964, Roy was sent to Vietnam as part of the first 125,000 Americans deployed to the conflict. While there, he was assigned to a highly classified operation that required him to dress up as an enemy combatant to gather intelligence deep in the jungle. During one of these missions, Roy was operating completely alone in a dense stretch of forest when he stepped directly on a landmine. The explosion was devastating, leaving him severely wounded and completely paralyzed on the jungle floor. Because the mission was classified and he was alone, there was no immediate help. Luckily, a squad of United States Marines came across his body a short time later. But because Roy was dressed in enemy clothing, the Marines assumed he was a fallen enemy soldier and almost walked right past him. Just before they left, one of the Marines decided to flip him over to check his face. That was when they discovered his American dog tags. They realized he was one of their own and immediately evacuated him to a military hospital. At the hospital, the doctors examined Roy and delivered some devastating news. They told him that his spinal injury was so severe that he would likely never walk again. The lead doctor advised him that he would have to be medically discharged from the Army. For Roy, this was worse than death. The Army was everything to him, and he desperately wanted to return to Vietnam to support his fellow soldiers. He pleaded with the doctors and nurses, begging them not to discharge him. He asked for some time to try to regain his strength. The medical staff agreed to a deal. They told him that if he was not walking within 1 year, they would have no choice but to medically retire him. Roy accepted the challenge, but he knew he could not do his physical therapy during the day when everyone was watching. So, every single night, after the doctors and nurses had left the ward and the other patients were asleep, Roy would begin his secret training. He would slide himself to the edge of his bed and let his limp body fall directly onto the hard floor. He could not use his legs, so he had to use his elbows and forearms to drag his body across the floor toward the wall. Once he reached the wall, he would pull himself up, trying to force his legs to support his weight. The pain in his spine was absolute agony, but he refused to stop. He would stand there, shaking and sweating, trying to take a step before collapsing back to the ground. He would drag himself back to his bed, climb in, and rest until the next night. He did this in complete secret every single night for 6 long months. During the day, the doctors and nurses watched his recovery and were completely stunned. They called it a miracle, having no idea that Roy was putting himself through a brutal training routine every night. After 6 months, the medical staff agreed that he was fit to stay in the Army. However, because of his severe injuries, the Army insisted on assigning him to a desk job in North Carolina. They did not want to risk him getting hurt again in combat. Roy was devastated by this decision, but he did not give up. As soon as he arrived in North Carolina, he began training like a maniac. He ran miles, lifted weights, and got into the best shape of his life. His plan was to try out for the Special Forces and become a Green Beret, which is one of the hardest combat units in the world. After a few months, his superiors were amazed by his physical condition and allowed him to try out. A couple of months later, Roy Benavidez successfully completed the training and earned his Green Beret. In 1968, 4 years after he was nearly killed by the landmine, Roy was sent back to Vietnam for his second combat tour. On May 2nd of that year, Roy had a rare day off. He was spending his day attending a church service inside a small wooden shack on their base. While listening to the chaplain, Roy heard a frantic radio call coming from the communications table just outside the shack. The voice on the radio sounded absolutely desperate, screaming for help over a constant barrage of heavy gunfire and explosions. Roy ran outside to listen to the radio. He learned that a 12-man Army Special Forces team had been dropped deep into the jungle on a classified mission, and they had been completely ambushed by an entire North Vietnamese Army infantry battalion. This meant that 12 American soldiers, many of whom Roy knew personally, were trapped in the middle of the jungle, surrounded by over 1,000 enemy combatants. As Roy was listening to this horrifying transmission, he heard the sound of incoming helicopters. He ran over to the landing zone and watched as 3 helicopters touched down, all of them completely riddled with bullet holes and pouring smoke. Roy ran up to one of the door gunners, who was a 19-year-old kid. The young soldier looked completely dazed. Before he could speak, he collapsed directly into Roy's arms and died. He had been shot multiple times during a failed rescue attempt. The pilot of the helicopter was devastated about the death of his gunner, but he was also deeply frustrated that they had been unable to rescue the trapped men. He wanted to go back out and try again. Roy did not hesitate. He immediately volunteered to go with him, climbed into the helicopter, and they took off. But in his rush to help his friends, Roy made a major mistake. He forgot to grab his rifle. All he had on him was his Bowie knife and a canvas bag filled with medical supplies. Despite this, he told the pilot to fly toward the ambush site. The pilot flew the helicopter over the border into Cambodia, heading toward the dense stretch of jungle where the team was trapped. As they drew closer, heavy ground fire started coming out of the trees, hitting the side of the helicopter with loud metallic thuds. The pilot had to perform constant aggressive zigzag maneuvers just to avoid being shot down. Through the thick canopy, they spotted a column of colored smoke. The trapped team had set off a smoke grenade to mark their position. The pilot tried to guide the helicopter down to get close, but every time he got near, the enemy fire intensified dramatically. The helicopter was taking heavy hits, and the pilot told Roy that they had to turn back. Roy refused. He told the pilot to hover as low as possible over the treetops, and he would jump out. The pilot thought he was crazy, telling him he would be killed instantly without a weapon, but Roy insisted. The pilot brought the helicopter to a low hover about 100 yards away from the team's position, and without a second thought, Roy leaped out of the open door. He plunged directly into the thick jungle canopy without a parachute or a gun, crashing through the branches and hitting the hard ground. He quickly stood up and began running through the jungle toward the team's position. The enemy soldiers were so shocked to see an unarmed American running through the forest by himself that they hesitated to fire. But when they finally did open fire, Roy was hit in the face and the back of his head by bullets. A grenade detonated right behind him, sending shrapnel tearing into his back and legs. Despite the severe pain and the blood pouring down his face, Roy kept running until he finally reached the perimeter where the trapped Special Forces team was holding out. When Roy reached the team, he found them in an absolutely horrific situation. They were huddled behind a few large trees, trying their best to return fire, but bullets were flying in from every direction. Out of the 12 men, 4 were already dead, and the remaining 8 were all critically wounded. One of the most able-bodied men left alive had been shot in the head, losing one of his eyes completely, and his other eye was so swollen and filled with blood that he could barely see. He was fighting to stay conscious, blindly firing his weapon in the general direction of the enemy. Roy immediately ran over to him, pulled him down behind cover, and gave him a shot of morphine to ease his pain. Roy then repositioned the soldier, pointing him in the right direction and telling him exactly where to aim so he could continue to defend their position. Under a non-stop storm of enemy bullets, Roy got down on his stomach and began to low-crawl through the dirt to reach each of the other wounded team members. One by one, he checked their wounds, administered morphine, and began the agonizing task of dragging them through the dirt to a slightly safer area that offered better cover. He had spotted a small clearing nearby and believed that if the helicopter pilot was brave enough, they might be able to land there to get the survivors out. During one of his trips back to the original ambush site to search for more survivors, Roy noticed something he had missed. He had not done a proper head count initially and did not realize that two members of the team had been completely cut off from the main group. They were pinned down in a small hollow, and the enemy was closing in on them. Roy knew he had to act fast, but he still did not have a weapon. He looked around and saw the body of a dead enemy soldier. He ran over, grabbed the soldier's rifle, and began sprinting toward the two pinned down men. As Roy ran toward the two men, he fired the rifle wildly in all directions to suppress the enemy fire. He was dodging a wall of bullets, and just as he got close to the two-man team, an enemy bullet tore clean through his thigh. The impact was painful, but Roy did not let it slow him down. He reached the two men and told them they had to move. He stood back up, ignoring the gaping wound in his leg, and began firing in both directions to cover them. He ordered the two men to crawl back toward the main group while he stood his ground, drawing all the enemy fire to himself. He kept shooting until both men had safely made it back to the main perimeter. Once they were secure, Roy ran the gauntlet once again, limping heavily and bleeding from his thigh, until he rejoined the group. Now that Roy had accounted for all the living members of the team and had moved them to the relatively safer area, he knew it was time to call in the rescue helicopter. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a smoke grenade. He threw it into the small clearing he had located earlier. A thick cloud of colored smoke began to rise through the trees. The helicopter pilot, who had dropped Roy off earlier, had not actually abandoned him. He had flown a short distance away to escape the heaviest fire, but he had remained in the area, waiting for a signal. When he saw the colored smoke rising from the clearing, he immediately guided the helicopter back into the danger zone. As the helicopter descended, enemy bullets began to rain down on it, pinging loudly off the metal sides. Despite the intense danger, the pilot held the helicopter steady and touched down in the tiny clearing. Roy immediately began coordinating the evacuation. The members of the team who were still able to move began making their way toward the open doors of the helicopter. Roy knew he needed to provide cover for them, so he began running around the perimeter, picking up discarded rifles from the ground and firing at the advancing enemy. He would empty a magazine, drop the gun, run to another spot, pick up another rifle, and keep shooting. He was a one-man army, doing everything in his power to keep the enemy from shooting down the helicopter while his men climbed aboard. Once Roy saw that most of the surviving men had safely boarded the helicopter, he realized he had a brief window of opportunity. He did not want to leave anyone behind, including the men who had already died in the battle. Roy made the decision to run back into the jungle to retrieve the bodies of his fallen teammates. He grabbed two rifles off the ground and ran back into the heavy gunfire. He was shooting with both hands, trying to keep the enemy at bay as he searched the thick brush. He eventually found the body of one of his closest friends, a soldier named Leroy Wright. Roy dropped his weapons, grabbed Leroy, and began the incredibly difficult task of hauling him back toward the helicopter. As he was dragging his friend's body through the dirt, an enemy bullet struck Roy directly in the stomach. The pain was blinding, and he struggled to stay on his feet. He tried to keep moving, but suddenly an enemy grenade detonated right behind him. The blast sent hot shrapnel tearing into his back and legs once again, and the sheer force of the explosion knocked him completely unconscious. He fell to the ground next to his friend, and everything went dark. When Roy finally opened his eyes, he was lying in the dirt, and his body was in absolute agony. He looked around and saw that the situation had gotten even worse. Through the trees, he could see dozens of enemy soldiers running toward his position. He realized that if he tried to carry Leroy's body back to the helicopter now, it would be a suicide mission, and he would be killed before he could reach it. He had no choice but to temporarily leave his friend behind. Roy forced himself to stand up, his body screaming in pain from the multiple gunshot and shrapnel wounds. He began running a wild zigzag pattern through the jungle, dodging bullets as he made his way back to the clearing where the helicopter was waiting. But when he finally broke through the trees and expected to see the helicopter taking off, he was met with a horrifying sight. The helicopter had not escaped. It had been hit by a massive amount of enemy fire while Roy was unconscious, and it had crashed hard onto the ground. The wreckage was now engulfed in bright orange flames and thick black smoke. The pilot had been killed instantly in the crash, but some of the wounded men Roy had just rescued were still alive inside the burning fuselage. They were trapped and unable to escape the fire. Without a single moment of hesitation, Roy ran directly toward the burning helicopter. He plunged into the intense heat and flames, grabbing the survivors one by one and pulling them out of the burning wreckage. He dragged them away from the fire and began moving them to a new defensive position further away in the jungle. He knew that the crash would attract even more enemy attention, and he needed to get them behind cover before the enemy began targeting the crash site with mortars. Roy managed to get all of the survivors to a new, relatively secure area, but as he looked around, he knew they were in extreme danger. There were hundreds of enemy fighters closing in, and the gunfire was relentless. Roy was running on pure adrenaline. His body was covered in blood, and he had multiple bullet wounds, but his mind was still completely focused on keeping his men alive. He realized they were about to be completely overrun, and their only option left was to call in a danger-close airstrike. Roy pulled out his map with shaking, bloody hands. He calmly located his coordinates, keyed his radio, and called the aircraft hovering overhead. He gave them his position and requested an immediate strike. A short time later, the sky filled with the roar of jet engines. Roy watched as a beautiful precision napalm strike hit the jungle floor just yards away from his position. The intense heat washed over them, but the fire did not touch his men. It completely incinerated the enemy forces that were advancing. Roy did not stop there. He continued to coordinate with the pilots, calling in multiple gun runs that shredded the enemy lines while leaving his own team untouched. For a short time, the airstrikes succeeded in keeping the enemy at bay. But eventually, the aircraft had to leave. The enemy immediately renewed their attack, and Roy was shot in his other leg. Believing they were about to be overrun, Roy crawled to each of his teammates and gave them a final shot of morphine to ease their pain. Suddenly, another rescue helicopter arrived, opening fire on the enemy. Roy dragged himself up once again and began carrying his teammates over to the helicopter. After he got the last of the survivors on board, he turned and saw two more teammates who had fallen down further back in the trees. He ran to help them, but an enemy soldier jumped out of the brush and hit Roy in the chest with his rifle butt, fracturing his skull and breaking his jaw. The soldier then stabbed Roy repeatedly with his bayonet. Roy managed to grab the bayonet, pull it out of himself, and kill the soldier with his Bowie knife. He then dragged the two remaining men to the helicopter, shooting two more enemy soldiers along the way. Roy was the last man to climb aboard as the helicopter lifted off into the sky, leaving the blood-soaked jungle behind. During the long helicopter ride back to the base, Roy was in absolutely horrific physical shape. He was bleeding profusely from dozens of separate wounds, and his abdomen had been sliced open so badly by the bayonet that he had to use his own hands to physically hold his intestines inside his stomach. He was completely silent, unable to move or speak, operating only on the absolute last remnants of his willpower. When the helicopter finally touched down at the medical base, the doctors and nurses rushed forward to unload the casualties. When they lifted Roy off the aircraft, they saw a body that was completely destroyed. Roy had a total of 37 separate wounds on his body, including multiple gunshot entry and exit wounds, deep bayonet punctures, and countless pieces of shrapnel embedded in his flesh. The medical staff checked for a pulse, but they could not find one. They listened for a heartbeat, but there was only silence. Roy was not breathing, and his body was cold. Believing there was absolutely nothing they could do, the doctors officially declared Roy Benavidez dead on the spot. His body was placed inside a heavy rubber body bag, and a doctor began to zip it closed. But Roy was actually still conscious. He was completely paralyzed by shock and blood loss, and he could not speak because his jaw had been shattered by the rifle butt. His eyes were also completely sealed shut by the dried blood that had poured down his face. He knew that if he did not find a way to let them know he was alive, he would be buried alive in that body bag. As the doctor pulled the zipper up toward his face, Roy gathered every single ounce of strength left in his body. He forced a small amount of saliva into his mouth and spit directly into the doctor's face. The doctor stopped zipping the bag in complete shock. He wiped his face, realized what had happened, and immediately ordered the medical team to get Roy out of the bag and onto an operating table. Unbelievably, Roy Benavidez had survived. He was prepped for emergency surgery, and once stabilized, he was flown to Japan for intensive care. After spending some time there, he was transferred to a military hospital in Texas, where he spent a year rehabbing from his severe injuries. Roy was immediately given the Distinguished Service Cross and was put in for the Congressional Medal of Honor, which is the military's highest award for valor. However, the paperwork took a very long time to be approved by the Department of Defense. Roy was not actually given the Congressional Medal of Honor until 1981, when President Ronald Reagan finally presented it to him during a special White House ceremony. Of the 12 men that were trapped in that jungle, 8 would survive, all thanks to Roy Benavidez. Roy passed away in 1998 as a result of complications from diabetes. He was 63 years old. His story of sheer survival and ultimate loyalty remains one of the most incredible tales of human determination ever told. He proved that even when the situation is completely hopeless, the human spirit can overcome any obstacle. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya. In the early 1990s, a young woman in her 20s named Krista Froder was managing a retail store called the Boston Store in Madison, Wisconsin. She was dedicated and professional, and she had a real knack for the job. Not long after she started there, the store hired another employee. His name was Bart Halderson. Like Krista, he was in his early 20s, though he was about 3 years younger than her. He was brought on as a clerk. Now, Bart and Krista didn't know each other before they started working together, but their shifts often lined up, and as time went on, they naturally started talking and getting to know one another. It didn't take long for them to realize they had a surprising amount in common. They had both grown up in the general area just outside of Madison. They had even graduated from the same college, the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And they discovered a shared passion for home design. Krista, who had majored in art history, was particularly passionate about the interior side of things, how a space could feel, the colors, the furniture, the whole atmosphere. Bart, on the other hand, was just one of those people who seemed to be born with a natural talent for fixing things. With just his bare hands and a few tools, he could figure out almost any problem. Growing up, his favorite projects were always related to home repairs. It didn't matter if it was something small and simple or a huge, complex undertaking. He just found this deep sense of satisfaction in keeping a home in perfect working condition. And so, surrounded by the daily routines of retail, Bart and Krista bonded over these shared interests and their similar background. Their casual work friendship slowly blossomed into something more, a genuine romance. By 1994, they had both moved on from the Boston store. They had gotten married and moved into their first apartment together in DeForest, Wisconsin, which wasn't too far from Madison. Life was starting for them, and everything felt full of promise. 2 years later, in 1996, Bart and Krista welcomed their first child, a little boy they named Mitchell. The moment Mitchell was born, Krista knew she wanted to stay home with him to be there for every little moment. Bart was completely supportive of her decision. He went out and secured a great job as an accountant, a position that paid well enough to support their growing family. Just 18 months after Mitchell arrived, they welcomed their second and final child, another boy whom they named Chandler. Their family felt complete. A few years after Chandler was born, Bart and Krista had diligently saved up enough money to finally buy a house of their own. The house they chose was a modest, small, two-story home in a very quiet, peaceful little town in Wisconsin called Windsor. Windsor was close to DeForest where they had been renting, but this little house was different. It was theirs. It was perfect for Bart, Krista, and their two young boys. It wasn't just about having enough space for the family to grow. Because it was their own home, Krista could finally unleash her passion for interior design. She carefully planned the layout of every room, and she took immense pride in keeping the house perfectly tidy and beautiful at all times. For Bart, this house was a canvas. He immediately dove into one home repair project after another. This house became his trophy, a symbol of everything he had worked for, and he was determined to keep that trophy polished and pristine. But it wasn't just the physical house that made it feel like their forever home. It was the community. As soon as they moved in, Bart and Krista made friends with all of their neighbors. The people on their street were incredibly friendly and welcoming. Before long, the Haldersons were deeply involved in community activities. They volunteered with the Boy Scouts and the Kiwanis Club. They donated their time and money to other local charities. It was clear, very quickly, that the Halderson family had found the place where they truly belonged. And so, for the next 2 decades, life for the Haldersons in that little home in Windsor was, by all accounts, perfect. Bart continued to climb the ladder at his accounting firm, providing a stable and comfortable life for his family. Krista remained a devoted mother and a meticulous housekeeper, creating a warm and loving home. As for their sons, Mitchell and Chandler, they were given every opportunity their parents could possibly afford them. They grew up in a loving, supportive environment, and both of them seemed to thrive. By 2021, the picture of the Halderson family was one of complete success. The older brother, Mitchell, who was now 25, had moved out and was living on his own in an apartment. He had graduated from college and landed an incredible IT job with a very successful local company. He was engaged to be married and was on the verge of buying his own house. He was following right in his parents' footsteps, building a solid and happy life for himself. As for the younger brother, Chandler, who was 23 at the time, he was still living at home with Bart and Krista, but he seemed to be doing just as well as his older brother. He was in his final year of college, on the cusp of graduation. He had already accepted a full-time, high-prestige job with SpaceX, which was set to start in Florida as soon as he had his degree. While finishing up his last year of school, he told his parents he was working part-time at a local insurance company to help pay them rent. He also said he was volunteering his remaining spare time with the Madison Police Department on their elite rescue scuba diving team. Chandler was also in a committed relationship with his girlfriend. Everything seemed to be going perfectly for Bart, Krista, Mitchell, and Chandler. But their lives were about to take a sudden and devastating turn for the worst. It all began in June of 2021. That month, Chandler, who was supposedly just weeks away from flying out to Titusville, Florida, to begin his dream job with SpaceX, had a terrible accident. He said he fell down an entire flight of stairs, smashing his head in the process. He told his family he immediately picked himself up and tried to convince himself that he was okay, just a bit shaken. But over the course of that day, he started to feel woozy and disoriented. He said his legs started to feel numb, and in a panic, he rushed himself to the hospital. Unfortunately, when doctors scanned his brain and checked him over, they supposedly discovered he had a severe concussion from the fall. They told him he had a brain bleed that would almost certainly require surgery at some point in the future. And the numbness in his legs, they said, appeared to be the result of permanent nerve damage. And so, just like that, Chandler, who had been so excited about this incredible opportunity in Florida, was suddenly back home, confined to the house, wearing a neck brace and using a cane to get around. Even with the cane, he could barely walk. To make matters even worse, he almost immediately lost the job at SpaceX. He told his family that because he couldn't travel to Florida to start on time, they had to fill the position with someone else. Chandler did his best to stay positive and optimistic in front of his family, but this was a crushing blow. Everything he had seemingly worked so hard for had just been snatched away. It was crushing for his family, too. Seeing their beloved Chaz, as they called him, lying on the couch all day, looking totally miserable and depressed, was awful. But as terrible as Chandler's accident was, the trauma it inflicted on him and his family was nothing compared to what was about to happen next. The Haldersons owned a small cabin in a part of Wisconsin called White Lake. It was located about a 3-hour drive north of their home in Windsor. The cabin was nestled inside a rural forested area right near a large lake, also called White Lake. This cabin had been in the Halderson family since the 1940s. When Mitchell and Chandler were little kids, Bart and Krista would take them up there all the time. They'd go fishing, swimming, or just relax by the water. It was their family vacation spot. But at some point, as the boys got older, they weren't as interested in going to the cabin anymore. As a result, Bart and Krista basically stopped going up there. However, just 2 weeks after Chandler's horrific injury, a huge storm rolled through the White Lake area. After the storm passed, Bart and Krista received a phone call. Some people who lived permanently in White Lake called them and said, "Hey, I was driving past your cabin and I saw there were some broken windows. It looks like your cabin might have been damaged by the storm." And so, Bart and Krista started to worry. They thought, "Oh my goodness, we have to get up there as soon as we can to patch up that window and check for any other damage before another storm rolls through and completely ruins the place." So, Bart and Krista pulled out their calendar. They saw that the next weekend was the 4th of July weekend. The 4th of July is a very big holiday in America, a celebration of independence. In White Lake, they celebrate it with a big parade down Main Street and a spectacular fireworks display out over the lake. Bart and Krista figured, you know what, let's just hold off for a couple of days and time our trip with the holiday weekend. We can make the necessary repairs and also enjoy the festivities, turn it into a little mini vacation. And so, that was the plan. But right before they were supposed to leave for this trip up to White Lake, Bart and Krista started acting a little strange. On the evening of Thursday, July 1st, the day before they were scheduled to leave, they began packing their things. Since Chandler was living with them and couldn't go anywhere due to his injury, he was at home and saw them getting ready. At one point, he got up and hobbled over, trying to help them pack, but it was short-lived because his legs were just too weak. So he sat back down and just watched them. And what he saw was odd. They were packing lots and lots of cash and several silver bars into their luggage. Chandler thought this was strange, but he decided not to say anything. He figured, you know what, maybe they want to stash their valuables in the cabin for safekeeping. It's their business, not mine. So Bart and Krista continued to pack, and Chandler continued to watch. At some point, he asked his parents, "So how are you getting up to White Lake?" His parents just said, "Oh, we're getting a ride from our friends, another couple. They're driving us up." But they didn't tell him who the couple was. They were vague, just saying, "our friends." Again, Chandler is sitting there thinking, okay, this whole thing is a little bit weird, but he told himself, it's their business. I'm not going to press them about it. They obviously don't want to tell me. So he just let it go. At some point, Bart and Krista finished packing. They moved all their luggage to the front of the house, right near the front door. A little while later, they and Chandler all went to their separate rooms and went to sleep. The next morning, Friday, July 2nd, Chandler got up early, around 6 in the morning. When he woke up, he began slowly hobbling his way down the stairs. He expected to see his mom and dad in the kitchen, having breakfast and getting ready to leave. They certainly wouldn't have left without saying goodbye. But when he got downstairs, the house was dark and completely empty. All of the bags that his parents had packed the night before and placed by the front door were gone. Chandler thought, did my parents get up at 5 in the morning and leave without telling me? He went to the front door and looked out the window, thinking maybe they were just waiting outside. But when he looked out, his parents weren't there. And sure enough, both of their cars were still parked in the driveway. So Chandler was left to conclude that, well, I guess my parents did get picked up by whoever these mystery friends were, and they just didn't feel the need to wake me up and tell me they were leaving. This did leave Chandler feeling a little shaken. He kept thinking about the strangeness of what they were packing, the fact that he didn't know who they were with, and now this sudden, quiet departure. But again, Chandler just told himself that his parents would be fine. These were just a few random, weird things, but they didn't necessarily mean there was a problem. So Chandler managed to push his concerns out of his mind and went about his day. Since his parents were now going to be gone for the weekend, he promptly called his girlfriend, Catherine, and asked her to come over and stay with him for a couple of days. She came over, and because Chandler couldn't really do anything because of his injury, they basically spent the weekend lounging around, eating nice food, and watching Netflix. But by the end of the weekend, on Sunday morning, there was an unspoken feeling that something was wrong. Chandler had told Catherine about the strange circumstances of his parents' departure, but he had assured her, "I'm sure it's fine," and she had agreed, saying, of course, his parents were fine. But by Sunday, Bart and Krista still hadn't called or texted. They hadn't checked in with Chandler or Mitchell or anyone. They were just completely silent. And whenever Chandler or Catherine tried calling Bart or Krista's cell phones, the calls didn't even ring. They went straight to voicemail. But late that day, on Sunday, July 4th, just as real concern was starting to mount, a text message came through to Chandler's phone. It was from his mom, Krista. The message basically said, "Hey, we arrived in White Lake. You know, it's packed here, the service is terrible, but we're going to stick around for the parade, and we'll be back either Monday night or early Tuesday." As soon as Chandler and Catherine saw this text, it was like a huge weight was lifted. All their worries seemed to vanish, and they were just excited to see Bart and Krista when they came back the next day or the day after. But the next day, Monday, Bart and Krista did not come home. They didn't call anyone, they didn't text anyone. And again, whenever anyone tried calling their cell phones, which now included Mitchell, who had been looped into the situation, the calls went straight to voicemail. Then, the day after that, on Tuesday, July 6th, the day Krista had said they would be home by, they still didn't come home. And again, no one could get in touch with them, and they hadn't contacted anyone. Additionally, on that Tuesday, Krista's office began calling Chandler and Mitchell. They were asking if the boys knew where their mother was. Krista had recently taken a customer service job at an auto body shop, and apparently she was scheduled to work on that Tuesday. She was also scheduled to work the previous Friday, the day she and Bart had left for the lake. This meant she had left on this trip without telling anyone at work. According to her boss, Krista was the kind of person who would call or text ahead, even if she was just running a couple of minutes late. For her to be a complete no-show without a word was totally out of character. But before Chandler, Mitchell, and Catherine could even process this new worrying information, Bart's employer started calling them, asking the same questions. "Hey, do you know where Bart is? He's supposed to be working right now, and we can't get in touch with him." He didn't put in for any time off. So all afternoon on Tuesday the 6th, Chandler, Mitchell, Catherine, and other family members were frantically trying to call Bart and Krista. They were calling other people they knew in White Lake to see if anyone had seen them, but nobody had. And so finally, the next morning, on Wednesday, July 7th, when there was still no word from Bart and Krista, Chandler went to the police and filed a missing persons report. Almost immediately, the police in Windsor contacted the police up north in White Lake. They asked them to do a welfare check on the Halderson cabin to see if maybe Bart and Krista were there and just had terrible service, or if maybe there had been some kind of accident. But when the White Lake police arrived at the cabin, Bart and Krista were not there. No one was. In fact, the cabin looked like it hadn't been used in months. The outside was totally overgrown with weeds, and inside there was no food in the fridge. And most interestingly, the police told Chandler, Mitchell, and Catherine that there was no damage to the cabin. There were no broken windows, no obvious signs of any storm damage at all. After this revelation, of course, the family's minds started racing. Wait a minute. Who called them and told them to go up there to fix broken windows that weren't even broken? Were those the same mystery friends who drove them up in the first place? What was going on? Was this some sort of trap? Had they been set up? Were they okay? By the following day, Thursday, July 8th, there was still no sign of Bart or Krista, and the police didn't have any new leads to speak of. Chandler was desperate. He went to the local media and pleaded with them. Please run a story about my parents. Get the word out that they're missing. Maybe someone knows something and will come forward. And the local media did just that. While this media coverage was going on, Chandler went back to his home and, with his cane, hobbled door to door, asking each of his neighbors if they had a security camera on the front of their house. He was hoping a camera might have captured an angle of the street and might have seen his parents on the morning of July 2nd when they supposedly climbed into that mystery couple's car. Chandler hoped that if he could get that footage, someone might be able to identify who these mystery friends were. But unfortunately, none of his neighbors had the right footage. As it would turn out, though, it didn't matter. Because on that same day, the 8th, the police made a discovery. At first, it seemed relatively small, a minor detail. But when they examined it more closely, they realized it was a huge breakthrough, one that would completely break the case wide open. To understand this breakthrough, we have to go back to the 29th of June, 2021. This was 3 days before Bart and Krista supposedly hopped into that mystery car and headed up to White Lake. On that day, June 29th, Bart had finally had enough. There was something that had been bothering him for a very long time, and he had finally decided that today was the day he was going to get to the bottom of it. So Bart pulled out his phone, he punched in a number, and he put it to his ear. After a few rings, a young man named Omar Job answered the call. In total, Bart and Omar would speak on the phone for 17 minutes. For the first half of the call, it was basically just Bart being angry and aggressive towards Omar. But during the second half of the call, when Omar finally had a chance to speak, Bart's tone completely changed. He was no longer angry. He actually sounded totally defeated. After this 17-minute phone call finally came to an end, Bart was left in a state of shock. But he knew what he had to do next. He needed to set up an even more intense meeting with a group of people, and he needed to tell them what he had just learned from Omar. Within 24 hours, Bart had arranged this additional high-stakes meeting. It was scheduled for 3 in the afternoon on July 1st. July 1st was the day before Bart and Krista would supposedly leave for White Lake. And so on July 1st, the day of this pivotal meeting, Bart was working from home. At some point, he looked at his watch and saw it was just after 2 in the afternoon. Even though the meeting was still an hour away, the location was a bit of a drive, and he knew he needed to leave soon. So Bart stopped working, and he sent a text message to Chandler, who was in the house with him. The text just said, "Ready to leave when you are." Chandler was fully aware of how important this meeting was for his dad. He also understood the terrible position his dad was in. And so he had agreed to go with his dad to this meeting. After a couple of minutes, both Chandler and Bart had gotten dressed and were ready. They met downstairs on the first floor. After a quiet nod to each other, they began walking towards the front door. But then, something happened. Chandler was standing just behind Bart. As they moved towards the door, Chandler reached out and grabbed a rifle that he had hidden on the first floor. He raised it, and he fired at least 2 shots into his father's back. And then, once his father fell to the ground, either dead or dying, Chandler, as calm as can be, pulled out his own phone. He texted his mother and told her, "Hey, Dad's phone is dead, so just text me." Then, Chandler sent his mother another text, a chillingly normal one. "Get soda on your way home." His mother simply replied, "Kay, I can," smiley face. All Chandler was trying to do was buy himself as much time as possible to prepare the house for his mother's return. Over the next couple of hours, we don't know exactly what Chandler did, But it's assumed he moved his father's body into a hiding place. And then, after maybe trying to clean up a little bit, Chandler laid in wait for his mother. At 4:58 p.m., Krista clocked out of her job at the automotive shop. She made a quick stop at a store to buy Chandler some soda. And then, between 5:15 and 5:30, security cameras on neighbors' houses captured her car pulling into her driveway. A couple of minutes later, she walked inside of her beautiful little dream home, the home where she had raised her family for the past 2 decades, only to be immediately gunned down by her own son the second she walked through the door. It would turn out Chandler was living a complete double life. He had never graduated from college. He had attended college, but only for about a semester, and he had flunked out. But he just kept telling his friends and his family that he was progressing through his classes and that he had eventually graduated. It was all a lie. He also did not have a job at the insurance company. He just told his family that he worked from home, which really meant he sat in his room and played video games all day. He was not a rescue scuba diver for the Madison Police Department. For one, he wasn't a scuba diver. And two, the Madison Police Department did not have a rescue scuba diving team. And, needless to say, he did not have a job with SpaceX. He had never even applied. As for his head injury, he may have bumped his head at some point, and he did go to the doctors by himself sometime in mid-June. But that doctor just told him he might have a mild concussion and offered him a neck brace, telling him he didn't even need to wear it unless he wanted to. But Chandler very quickly turned this non-injury into a debilitating, crippling, life-altering condition. He literally hobbled around everywhere with a neck brace and a cane, and the reason he did that was because he needed an excuse. He needed a reason for why he wasn't starting his non-existent job at SpaceX. In short, Chandler lied about virtually every aspect of his life to virtually everyone he knew. And for the most part, people believed him. However, his parents were becoming more and more suspicious, especially in 2021. He was telling them, oh yeah, I'm working at the insurance company, but he never had any money. He could barely pay them rent if he paid at all. And so his dad, Bart, would ask him, how is it that you're employed but you have no money? The way Chandler handled this was elaborate. He would create fake email accounts, pretending to be people in human resources at the insurance company. Then, acting as them, he would write these convoluted emails with ridiculous excuses for why Chandler hadn't been paid yet. He would have that fake email account email his real account. Then, from his actual email, Chandler would write back, acting angry and stern, saying, you have to fix this, my family's not happy. Then he would once again pretend to be the HR person and reply, I'm so sorry, it's some internal issue, we're going to fix it, but you just have to wait. Chandler would take these fake exchanges and forward them to his father. And while Bart didn't necessarily believe what he was seeing, it was enough to get him to stop asking questions, at least for a little while. But Bart and Krista were also suspicious of other parts of Chandler's life, like his school records. At some point, he needed to show them his transcripts. He would tell them, oh, I can't access my transcripts, and Bart and Krista were like, why can't you? Just log in and pull up your unofficial transcripts. The way Chandler handled this was the same way he handled the insurance company lie. He created fictitious email accounts of people who were supposedly college advisors at Madison College, where he claimed to have graduated from. He would conduct these phony back-and-forth email chains where it looked like the college was telling Chandler, sorry, you can't get your transcripts. It's this huge problem that's totally our fault, not yours. But you just have to wait. There's nothing we can do right now. When Chandler would forward these exchanges to Bart, Bart would get totally worked up about it. Finally, he demanded that Chandler give him a phone number so he could talk to one of these college advisors himself. So Chandler went out and bought a burner phone from a convenience store. He gave that phone number to his dad. And when his dad called the number, somebody picked up, introducing themselves as Daniel Spieth. But it was really just Chandler disguising his voice. And this Daniel Spieth gave Bart the same spiel about how sorry he was and how it was all the college's fault that they couldn't get his son's transcripts and he was just going to have to wait. And so finally, on the 29th of June, 2021, Barney'd had enough. He was convinced his son was lying. There was just too much about his son's life that didn't add up. So Bart decided he was just going to call Madison College himself, pretend to be Chandler, and see if he could get the transcripts. And so he dialed the number for customer service at Madison College. And after a few rings, Omar Job, a customer service representative, picked up. Initially, Bart was aggressive and mean towards Omar for no real reason other than his immense frustration with the whole situation. He's on the call pretending to be Chandler, and he's barking at Omar, "Give me my transcripts right now. I go to your school. There's no reason you can keep them from me." But after a couple of minutes, Omar was finally able to get a word in. He said, "Hey, Chandler, I looked you up in the system, and you don't go to this school. You've never gone to this school except for maybe one semester, and you failed out." It's at this point, when Bart hears these words, that he just pauses for a really long time on the call. Then he begins asking follow-up questions that aren't really connected to getting transcripts anymore, because now he knows the transcripts don't exist. He begins asking Omar, "Does Daniel Spieth still work there?" Omar looks him up and says, "No, there's no Daniel Spieth that works here. And there's no Daniel Spieth that's ever worked here." Because Chandler had used 5 or 6 different fake names when pretending to be college advisors, Bart, in addition to asking about Daniel Spieth, asked about every other name he had interacted with. And one by one, Omar told him, "I'm sorry, those people do not work here. I've never heard of these people. They're not in our directory. I'm sorry." At the end of that 17-minute call, Bart knew. His son was living a monumental lie. So he hung up with Omar, and then Bart called the real college advisors at Madison College. He set a meeting for July 1st at 3 in the afternoon. And then he told Chandler that he had set this meeting and that Chandler was going to come with him, and together they were going to ask those advisors why they couldn't produce Chandler's transcripts. Bart, of course, knew Chandler didn't have transcripts. So he likely set this meeting up as an ultimatum, a way to force Chandler to finally call the meeting off and come clean about this huge lie, so that Bart could help his son get back on the right track, stop lying, and start living a real life. But the way Chandler handled being caught was not to own up to any of it. He didn't call off the meeting. He just waited until the day of the meeting, and then he killed his father, killed his mother, and then dismembered their bodies. He burned their body parts in the family fireplace, including their heads. And when he couldn't completely destroy their bodies that way, he took what was left of their remains and scattered them all over town, in parks, in forests, in rivers. He even put his father's headless, armless, legless torso behind his girlfriend's parents' house. And all the while he's doing this, he's spinning this ridiculous story to his girlfriend, to his brother, to other members of the Halderson family, to the police, to his parents' colleagues. He tells them Bart and Krista just up and left on the morning of July 2nd with this mystery couple. And oh, by the way, my parents were packing cash and silver bars in their luggage. So, I don't know, they went up to White Lake and now they're gone. I don't know what happened to them. We don't know why Chandler chose this specific story. It's unclear if he was trying to make it seem like his parents were suspicious and had gotten into something that got them harmed or kidnapped, or if he was trying to make it seem like his parents were just gullible and had been taken advantage of. We don't know. He was just trying to make the whole situation seem plausibly suspicious. Ultimately, though, Chandler did so many things that got him caught. From the mountain of physical evidence he left behind inside of the house where he killed and dismembered his parents, and also at the various dump sites where he didn't even bother to bury the body parts. He would just put them underneath some sticks and branches, so they were very easy to find. To his extremely suspicious behavior on July 7th when he walked into the police station to report his parents missing. That whole time he was talking to police officers, he was acting so weird and saying things that just didn't make sense. He came off like a guy who did not care at all that his parents were gone and who was clearly hiding something. But the big breakthrough that happened on July 8th, the one that broke the case open, stemmed from that text message that Krista's phone sent to Chandler's phone on July 4th. When Chandler walked into the police station on July 7th and said his parents were missing, one of the first questions they had for him was, "Okay, well, when was the last time you spoke to your parents?" Chandler told them he got a text message from his mother on Sunday, July 4th. He showed them the message. It said they had arrived in White Lake and they were going to be sticking around for the parade and they'd be back in a couple of days. But the police noticed a critical flaw. The text message had been sent on July 4th. But in White Lake that year, the big 4th of July parade was on July 3rd. So when this text came through, the parade that anyone in White Lake would have been aware of, it's a small place, you wouldn't miss it, had already happened. So why would Krista be texting her son that she was going to stick around for a parade that was already over? This led police to check phone records. And they would discover that yes, that text message was sent from Krista's phone to Chandler's phone, but when it was sent on July 4th, Krista's phone was not in White Lake. Instead, it was inside the Halderson home right near Chandler's phone. When police went to the Halderson house, they searched it. They found Krista's phone in the garage, underneath a drawer, inside of a shoe, wrapped in tinfoil, right next to her driver's license. Chandler had obviously sent that text message himself using his mother's phone. But he had gotten the date of the parade wrong. This one discrepancy opened up the floodgate. Before long, it was beyond obvious that Chandler was the killer. And after a thorough investigation, it was determined that Chandler had acted entirely alone. His girlfriend, Catherine, and his brother Mitchell had nothing to do with it. They were just innocent bystanders caught in his web of deceit. Chandler would ultimately be found guilty of killing his parents. He would be sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. To this day, Chandler has still not taken any responsibility for what he's done. Instead, he just tells anyone who will listen that his plan is to continue to appeal his verdict, clinging to his lies until the very end. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya. Before dawn on a quiet Saturday in March of 1997, a police captain was making his final patrol through the sleeping outskirts of a small town in North Carolina. The road, a stretch of highway that connected the town to the larger city of Charlotte, was almost completely empty. But up ahead, the captain saw something that didn't belong. There was a red Jeep parked oddly on the shoulder of the road, its headlights cutting through the pre-dawn darkness. It was just sitting there. This was suspicious enough for the captain to slow down and pull his patrol car in behind it. He got out, the air cool and still, and started walking towards the Jeep. As he got closer, he could hear the low hum of the engine. It was still running. He saw the driver's side window was all the way down. But when he walked around to that side of the vehicle and shined his flashlight inside, he saw that nobody was there. The driver's seat was empty. The whole car was empty. He stood there for a moment, trying to make sense of it. And then a sound cut through the quiet. A cell phone, sitting on the passenger seat, began to ring. In the early morning hours of Saturday, the 29th of March 1997, a 26-year-old waitress named Kim Medlin was finishing up her shift. She worked at a topless bar in Charlotte called the Men's Club, and tonight she was wearing a leotard and tights as she carried a tray of filet mignons through the bustling, smoke-filled room. She navigated past the main stage, where women were dancing, and delivered the food to a table of businessmen. Kim worked here 3 or 4 nights a week, and for the most part, she didn't mind the job. The money was very good, and working the late shift meant her days were completely free. That freedom was important, because it let her focus on the 2 things she loved most in the world: taking care of her horses and turning her brand new house into a home. Kim and her husband Bridger had just achieved a major life goal. They'd bought a beautiful 7-acre plot of land just outside the nearby town of Monroe, which was where Bridger had grown up. They spent the better part of the last year building their dream home from the ground up. They even built a barn for their 3 horses. Now, with all the heavy construction finally done, they were in the middle of moving in, unpacking boxes, and making the place their own. As Kim delivered the stakes, she glanced up at a clock on the wall. She saw she had less than an hour to go, and a little wave of excitement went through her. She had the next 3 days off, and she had big plans. Simple plans, but they were all that mattered to her. She was going to finish unpacking the last of the boxes and finally start hanging pictures on the walls. She flashed the businessmen a quick, professional smile, and then moved on to check her other tables. An hour later, just a little after 2 in the morning, Kim walked out the back entrance of the club. She'd changed out of her work uniform and was now wearing a comfortable, baggy sweatshirt. She called out a quick goodbye to a few of her coworkers who were lingering outside, and then walked over to her red Jeep parked along the side of the building. She climbed inside, tossed her purse onto the cow print seat cover on the passenger seat, started the engine, and turned on some music for the hour-long drive home. About 30 minutes later, Kim was driving south down Old Charlotte Highway. It was a secluded 2-lane road that was pretty much completely deserted at this time of night. She used to find this part of her commute relaxing, a quiet time to decompress after a long shift. But lately, driving this road alone late at night had started to make her nervous. The reason was because just a couple of weeks earlier, while driving home from work around this exact same time, she'd been involved in a really scary road rage incident. Another car had come up fast from behind her and started tailgating her aggressively. They were flashing their lights and honking their horns over and over again for absolutely no reason. Kim had been terrified. She thought maybe it was a customer from the club who had followed her, and her mind started racing with all the terrible possibilities. It freaked her out so much that when she saw the lights of a convenience store up ahead, she immediately pulled into the parking lot. Her heart was pounding, but then she felt a huge sense of relief. There was a police car parked right there. She didn't hesitate. She got out of her Jeep and went straight over to the officer to explain what had just happened and ask for help. He was very kind and took her seriously. He promised he would go try to track down the driver who had been harassing her. He even sent out a broadcast over the police radio telling all the other officers on duty to keep an eye out for Kim's red Jeep on the night she was working, just in case anyone ever gave her trouble again. The road rager was never caught, but knowing that the local police were aware of her situation and were looking out for her did make Kim feel a little bit better. Still, the fear lingered. The person was still out there. So tonight, as she drove down that same dark, empty highway, she decided to do something to calm her nerves. She reached into her purse, fished out her cell phone, and called her husband, Bridger. When Bridger answered, he told her he was actually on the road too. He worked as a DJ, and tonight he'd had a gig at a high school prom in a town about 2 hours away. He was just finishing his own drive home. They chatted for a few minutes, the easy conversation of a married couple just checking in. Then, Bridger told Kim that he was just pulling into their driveway. He said he would run inside, get settled, and call her right back. Kim agreed, said goodbye, and they hung up. She kept driving, feeling a little more at ease now. About 15 minutes passed. It was now a little before 3 in the morning. Her phone rang again. Just as he promised, it was Bridger calling her back from the house. He asked her where she was, if she was close. She told him she was just passing the Union Station restaurant, a local landmark. That meant she was only about 20 minutes away from home. Bridger said he was exhausted from his long night and was about to head to bed. Just in case he was already asleep by the time she walked in the door, he wished her a good night. Kim said goodnight back, told him she loved him, and then she hung up the phone, placing it down on the passenger seat beside her purse. She turned her full attention back to the dark road ahead. But just as she did, a sudden, blindingly bright light filled her car. She instinctively glanced up at her rearview mirror and saw a pair of headlights right on her tail. An hour later, Bridger Medlin sat up in bed. He looked over at the clock on his nightstand. It read 3:59 a.m. It had been a full hour since he'd spoken to Kim. She should have been home 40 minutes ago. She was only 20 minutes away when they talked. A knot of worry started to form in his stomach. He got out of bed and walked through their new 2-story house, checking every room, calling out her name, but Kim wasn't there. There was no sign that she had ever come home. Bridger looked out the front window. Her red Jeep wasn't in the driveway either. Now he was starting to panic. He hurried into the kitchen, picked up the landline, and dialed Kim's cell phone number. The phone rang a few times, and then a man's voice answered. It wasn't a voice he recognized. Confused, Bridger asked who was speaking. The man on the other end told him he was a police officer with the Monroe Public Safety Department. Bridger's heart sank. He asked the officer, "Okay, well, where's my wife?" The officer's reply was not reassuring. He told Bridger that he didn't know where his wife was. He had just come across a red Jeep idling on the side of the highway. He found the phone inside, and when it started ringing, he just answered it. But as for the driver, he said, "There's nobody here." A few minutes later, so a little after 4 a.m., on March 29th, Assistant Chief Bobby Hulk, an investigator with the Monroe Public Safety Department, was driving north along Old Charlotte Highway. He drove past the closed businesses and dark houses until he reached the very edge of town. And then he saw it. Up ahead, a red Jeep parked on the shoulder of the opposite side of the road. There was a patrol car parked right behind it, its lights quietly flashing. Hulk made a U-turn and pulled his own car onto the shoulder. As he got out, he saw Captain David Simpson standing there waiting for him. Simpson quickly filled him in. He'd found the Jeep idling there about 15 minutes ago. Headlights on, engine running, but totally empty. He said he was about to call it in when the cell phone on the passenger seat started to ring. He answered it on instinct, and it was a man named Bridger Medlin, frantically looking for his wife, Kim. Captain Simpson also told Hulk something else that was important. He said he actually recognized the Jeep. He remembered it from a strange run-in he'd had just 2 weeks earlier, outside a convenience store with Kim Medlin herself. He put two and two together. This was definitely Kim's car, but Kim was nowhere to be found. The name Kim Medlin also rang a bell for Assistant Chief Hulk, but for a different reason. He actually happened to be personal friends with her husband, Bridger. This case was already personal. Hulk pulled out his flashlight and began to carefully look inside the Jeep. Right away, he saw a wallet lying open on the passenger seat. He picked it up and looked inside. There were credit cards and there was cash. But the clear plastic slot in the wallet, the spot where you'd slide in your driver's license, was empty. It looked like the license had been deliberately taken out. The initial theory that popped into their heads was a traffic stop. Maybe Kim got pulled over by an officer and had taken her license out to hand it over. But in a small department like Monroe's, there were only a handful of officers on duty at this hour. Hulk asked Captain Simpson if any of the on-duty officers had reported pulling someone over that night. Simpson was already ahead of him. He had already checked. And the answer was no. None of their officers had made a traffic stop. This immediately made Hulk wonder about something else. Maybe Kim had been pulled over by someone posing as a cop. These so-called blue light bandits weren't common, but there had been reports over the years of criminals using flashing lights to pull over and harass drivers, especially young women driving alone. It was a disturbing thought, but those cases were rare. Hulk didn't want to jump to any conclusions just yet. Just then, Hulk heard the rumble of a truck engine and saw another set of headlights approaching up the highway. He set the wallet back down on the seat and walked over as a black pickup truck pulled to a stop right behind his car. A tall man with blonde hair jumped out of the driver's seat. Hulk knew him immediately. It was his friend and Kim's husband, Bridger. Bridger looked frantic, his eyes wide with fear and panic. He rushed towards Hulk, demanding to know what had happened to his wife. Hulk tried to calm him down, explaining that they were there to figure that out. He told Bridger what they had found so far, just the car, with no broken windows, no slashed tires, no obvious signs of a struggle. He suggested that it was possible Kim had just run into some car trouble and had walked off to find help. But Bridger wasn't listening. Without asking for permission, he pushed right past Hulk and climbed directly into the driver's seat of the Jeep. He said, "Well, let's test your theory right now and see if the car was working." Hulk, stunned, told him to get out of the Jeep, that it was a potential crime scene. But Bridger completely ignored him. He put his wife's car in drive and moved it forward a few inches. Then he put it in reverse and backed it up, parking it right back in its original spot. He'd just proven the car worked perfectly fine. And in the process, he had potentially destroyed any evidence that might have been there. Hulk was annoyed, but he also couldn't help but think, this is very bad. Whatever happened here, it wasn't car trouble. Something was seriously wrong. Hulk walked over to his patrol car and radioed the dispatcher for reinforcements. He specifically asked for a police dog so they could try to track Kim's scent in case she had left the area on foot. A few minutes later, 2 more police cars arrived, and a few officers and a canine handler with his dog got out. Hulk opened the doors to the Jeep, and the dog jumped inside, sniffing around the seats and the floor, getting familiar with the scent of Kim and her belongings. After a moment, the dog seemed to pick up a trail on the ground next to the car. The officers told Bridger, who was pacing back and forth and clearly wanted to follow them, to stay put by his truck. Then they followed the dog as it led them down the dark road for about 100 yards. Then the dog made a sharp turn onto a long, private driveway. Hulk and the other officers followed the dog up the driveway, which led towards a small house nestled among some trees just off the highway. The dog sniffed all the way up to the garage of the house, and then it stopped. The trail ended right there. Hulk went up to the front door of the house and rang the doorbell. A minute later, a man answered. Despite the late hour, he looked wide awake, and he didn't seem particularly surprised to see a group of police officers on his doorstep. Hulk asked the man for his name and if he had seen or heard anything unusual in the past couple of hours. The man said his name was Nathan Hargett. He told them that about an hour ago, maybe around 3:45 a.m., he'd been woken up by the sound of a strange car loitering near his garage. Nathan said he hadn't recognized the car, but he did notice that it had Texas license plates. He also told them he'd seen a woman with blonde hair in the back seat. Hulk asked Nathan for permission to search his property, and Nathan immediately agreed. Hulk directed the other officers to search inside the house while he went over to the garage. He found a side door on the garage and tried the handle. It was unlocked. He pushed the door open and shined his flashlight inside. But all he saw was a pickup truck and some gardening tools. There was no sign of Kim. By the time the sun started to rise around 6 a.m. that morning, this was officially a missing persons case. Police, with the help of concerned members of the community, began a massive search of the woods and fields surrounding Old Charlotte Highway. Meanwhile, Hulk and Captain Simpson went back to the police station to speak with one of the dispatchers who had been on duty the night before. After interviewing Nathan Hargett and searching his property, they had ruled him out as a suspect. So now, their focus shifted to that mysterious car with Texas plates that Nathan had seen. They were hoping that maybe there had been a report of a traffic stop or a call about a suspicious car in the area, anything at all that might help them figure out who was driving that vehicle. But the dispatcher told them the same thing. It had been a quiet night, no stops, no suspicious vehicle reports. However, she said, there had been one minor incident in the area that night. It was around 2 a.m., which was about an hour before Kim was last heard from. They had gotten a call about a car that had run into a ditch not too far from where Kim's Jeep was ultimately found. Hulk asked which officer had responded to that call. The dispatcher said it was car 491, which was driven by a young rookie officer named Josh Griffin. Hulk immediately got Officer Griffin on the phone. He asked him if he had seen or heard anything unusual while he was out there responding to the car in the ditch. But Griffin said no. He explained that his shift was technically already over when a driver had flagged him down for help. So he had just called for a tow truck, and when it arrived a little after 2:30 a.m., Griffin said he simply went home. Hulk hung up the phone, feeling disappointed. Bridger had said the last time he spoke to Kim was around 3 a.m. If the car in the ditch was already being towed away by 2:30, then it definitely wasn't the same car that Nathan saw outside his garage an hour later. And the driver of that car was likely not involved. Hulk sighed in frustration. But then, another idea occurred to him. He asked Captain Simpson to tell him more about that random run-in he'd had with Kim 2 weeks earlier. It felt like a long shot, but Hulk wondered if maybe the same driver from that road rage incident could have come back, found her again, and maybe chased her off the road. Simpson said he would go dig up the report he had filed on the incident and left to go find it. About half an hour later, Hulk sat at his desk reading through a copy of the police report. It stated that in the very early morning hours of Saturday, March 15th, exactly 2 weeks before Kim's disappearance, Kim had pulled into a convenience store and flagged down Captain Simpson and another officer who was with him, an officer named Roger Griffin. It turned out that Officer Roger Griffin was actually the father of Josh Griffin, the rookie officer who had responded to the car in the ditch. The report went on to say that Simpson and his partner, Roger Griffin, had actually managed to catch up with the car that had been harassing Kim a little further down the road. There were 2 men inside, Eric Williams and George Connell. They claimed that they thought Kim was the one harassing them by flashing her high beams. To Simpson and Griffin at the time, it had all seemed like a big misunderstanding, so they had just let the 2 men go with a warning. But Hulk, looking at this report through a very different lens now, felt that he needed to speak with Eric and George, regardless of what the report said. He found their contact information and called them both. But it turned out both men had rock-solid, airtight alibis for the entire night of Kim's disappearance. Still, something about it bothered Hulk. It struck him as an incredible coincidence that Kim had gone missing from her car on the exact same road at the same time of night and on the same night of the week as the road rage incident just 2 weeks prior. He had a very hard time believing it was all just a coincidence. The next day, just after sunset on Sunday, March 30th, Hulk was driving down Westwood Industrial Drive. It was a deserted, dead-end street at the edge of town, about 2 miles from where Kim's Jeep had been found. As he drove, he saw a couple of police cars parked at the end of the street. He pulled his own car in behind them and got out. He walked into the woods, following the beams of several flashlights that were moving around in the darkness. As he got closer, he saw officers putting up yellow police tape around a small clearing. And then, on the ground in the center of that clearing, he saw a pair of feet in sneakers poking out from underneath a messy pile of roofing shingles and tree branches. The police had gotten a call earlier that evening from 2 men. They were part of the community search effort for Kim, and they had told the dispatcher that they had found a body in the woods at this spot, but that they hadn't touched anything. Now, with Hulk on the scene, the forensics team began to carefully remove the shingles and branches that were covering the body. Hulk pulled out his own flashlight and knelt down to get a better look. He saw immediately that it was a deceased woman. And there was no doubt in his mind that it was Kim Medlin. She was only wearing a pair of shorts, a bra, and a sweatshirt that had been violently pulled up over her head. One side of her face was very badly beaten. There were cuts and bruises all over her neck and scrapes on her knees consistent with a struggle. He noticed that her necklace and her wedding ring were still on. This wasn't a robbery. Hulk stood back as the forensics team worked. They carefully untangled Kim's sweatshirt from around her wrists so they could take clippings of her fingernails just in case she had managed to scratch her killer and leave behind a trace of their DNA. As Hulk watched one of the forensics officers get ready to put the sweatshirt into an evidence bag, he suddenly noticed something and shouted for the officer to stop. Hulk stepped closer and shined his flashlight directly onto the fabric of the sweatshirt. And there, illuminated in the beam of light, was a clear, distinct shoe print. He immediately told the officers to send that sweatshirt directly to the crime lab and see if they could figure out the size and the type of shoe that had left that print. He knew he would have to wait for those results, but he already had a couple of other big clues to help him narrow down a list of suspects. The first was the location of Kim's body. Westwood Industrial Drive was known locally as a lover's lane, a secluded, out-of-the-way spot where people often went to be alone. The fact that Kim's killer had thought to bring her body here meant they were probably a local, someone who knew the area well. It was still theoretically possible that she'd been run off the road by a random stranger, or that a customer had followed her home from work, or even that it was a blue light bandit. But the second big clue pointed away from a stranger. There was no sign of a struggle at Kim's Jeep. Because of that, Hulk didn't think she had been kidnapped by a stranger. He thought it was far more likely that she had willingly gotten out of her car for somebody that she knew and trusted. The very next day, Monday, March 31st, Hulk sat down in an interrogation room across from his friend and his first official murder suspect, Kim's husband, Bridger. From the very beginning, Bridger had been overly involved in the investigation. He had contaminated the crime scene by getting into the Jeep without permission. And now, Hulk had received information that Bridger had lied about his alibi. When Kim first went missing, Bridger had told the police that he got home around 2:30 that morning, called Kim for a brief chat a little before 3, and then immediately went to bed. But now, another police officer had told Hulk that he had personally seen Bridger's black pickup truck driving around the center of town around 2:30 a.m., which was nowhere near Bridger's house and not on the route he would have taken home from his DJ gig. As soon as Hulk sat down, he could see that Bridger was visibly distraught. He had just learned that his wife had been found murdered. But Hulk had a job to do. He cut right to the chase. He told Bridger that another officer had seen his truck in town, that it contradicted his alibi, and he asked him, "Why did you lie?" Immediately, Bridger exploded. He was furious. He shouted at Hulk, saying he couldn't believe that at a time like this, Hulk would accuse him of lying. He was insinuating that he had hurt his own wife. He yelled that he didn't do this. He also shouted at Hulk for wasting precious time looking at him as a suspect when there were so many other clues pointing to a different story. He brought up the lack of a struggle at the Jeep, the rolled-down window, and the missing driver's license, all of which, he argued, made it look like a traffic stop that had gone horribly wrong. Bridger said he knew Kim better than anyone, and she would never, ever get out of her car in the middle of the night for a stranger, especially not after that terrifying road rage incident just 2 weeks earlier. She was on edge. She just wouldn't have done it. When Hulk left the interrogation room a few minutes later, he told his team to track down any and all security footage they could find from around town on the night Kim was killed. They needed to see if there was any proof that Bridger was really driving around when he claimed he was at home. For now, they had no physical evidence linking him to the crime, and they had to let him go. But Bridger's anger and defensiveness stuck with Hulk. It made him suspicious. And the fact that Bridger had insisted his wife would never have gotten out of her car for a stranger only reinforced Hulk's own theory. She might not have gotten out for a stranger, but she might have gotten out for you, Bridger. Or, Hulk thought, she might have gotten out for the police. Hulk already knew that no official Monroe police officers had pulled anyone over that night, but someone could have been pretending to be a police officer, a blue light bandit. That theory still made a lot of sense. Hulk thought about that bulletin that had gone out over the police radio 2 weeks ago, the one telling officers to be on the lookout for Kim's Jeep. Police radios were not private channels. Anyone with a simple police scanner could have been listening in. And what they would have heard was that a young woman named Kim often drove down this particular road all by herself late at night. They could have been waiting for her, knowing she was a vulnerable target. So Hulk picked up his phone and began calling around to other police departments in the region. He actually found out there had been 2 separate recent reports of blue light bandits harassing women. One of the culprits had already been caught, and he was in jail on the night Kim was killed, so it couldn't have been him. But the other suspect was still at large and had never been found. A couple of days later, on April 4th, Assistant Chief Bobby Hulk slammed his phone down in frustration and crossed another name off a list on his notepad. It had been 5 days since Kim's body was found, and all the initial leads he'd had were turning into dead ends. His team had tracked down surveillance footage from the night of Kim's disappearance. There was no sign of Bridger's truck driving through town until well after 4 a.m., after Kim's Jeep had already been found by Captain Simpson. It seemed the officer who claimed to have seen Bridger's truck at 2:30 a.m. had simply been mistaken, just as Bridger had furiously insisted. So Bridger's alibi was solid. Hulk had also reached out to Kim's manager and coworkers at the bar, thinking maybe her killer was a patron who had followed her. But none of them knew of any problems or issues she'd had with any customers. Meanwhile, Hulk's team had located and spoken to a man who worked the night shift at a business near where Kim's Jeep had been found. He said he had left work a little before 3 a.m. on the night Kim disappeared. As he was waiting to turn onto Old Charlotte Highway, he saw her red Jeep drive past. And right behind it, he saw another car that had been going in the opposite direction make a sudden, sharp three-point turn and speed off after the Jeep. The man said this other car had lights on the roof and reflective tape on the back. He had assumed it was a police car, but he didn't get a good look at the markings. Now, Hulk knew for a fact that every single Monroe police officer who was on duty that night was accounted for, and none of them had pulled anyone over at the time Kim went missing. However, this new witness testimony certainly did support the theory that Kim's killer was posing as a police officer. It supported the blue light bandit theory. So Hulk had spent the last couple of days trying to track down any witnesses who had seen that other blue light bandit, the one who was recently reported in a nearby town but had never been caught. But he kept coming up dry. No one knew anything that could help him track down that suspect. It really seemed like the investigation was grinding to a halt. But then Hulk's phone rang. He answered it. It was an expert from the forensics lab. He had just finished analyzing the shoe print that had been found on Kim's sweatshirt. Hulk leaned forward in his chair, a feeling of nervous anticipation washing over him as the expert told him the results. And when he heard what the expert had to say, Hulk knew exactly how to find Kim's killer. Based on that shoe print, witness testimony, and other forensic evidence, this is what police believe happened to Kim Medlin on the 29th of March 1997. Around 3 a.m., the killer was driving down Old Charlotte Highway. They had been out prowling for hours, sometimes pulling over young women for minor traffic violations, sometimes for no reason at all, just to exert their authority. And as they drove, they saw a familiar red Jeep pass by. The killer had seen that Jeep driving down this same road several nights a week for the past couple of weeks. They had become obsessed with the young blonde woman who drove it. And tonight, they decided it was finally time to act on that obsession. So they pulled an abrupt, aggressive three-point turn, raced up behind the Jeep, and flipped on their car's flashing blue and red lights. A moment later, the red Jeep pulled over onto the shoulder as expected. The killer got out of their car and walked up to the driver's side window. The woman inside, Kim, rolled down her window. She handed over her driver's license, and then she politely asked what the problem was. The killer didn't answer her question. Instead, they just told her to get out of the car. Kim was visibly confused, but she was dealing with a police officer, so she did as she was told. The moment she was out of the car, the killer slapped a pair of handcuffs onto her wrists, dragged her over to their patrol car, and shoved her into the back seat. Then, the killer got back in their own driver's seat as Kim started crying in the back, insisting that she hadn't done anything wrong, asking why she was being arrested. But the killer wasn't listening. Their mind was racing. They realized that even though they had been fantasizing about this moment for weeks, they hadn't actually planned what to do next. So, after a moment, they pulled their car over to the side of the road and just idled for a minute trying to figure out their next move. And then, an idea came to them. They put the car in drive and continued down the highway, turning onto a secluded dead-end road. As they drove down this dark road, Kim, in the back seat, suddenly went very quiet. The killer noticed the silence and looked in the rearview mirror. They saw her moving around, fiddling with something behind her back. And then the killer realized, with a jolt of panic, that in all their excitement, they had forgotten to engage the child's safety locks on the rear doors. The killer immediately reached for the power lock button on their own door, but it was too late. The rear door flew open, and Kim jumped out of the moving car. The killer slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a hard stop. They leaped out and ran back towards Kim, who was lying in the middle of the road, her hands still cuffed behind her back. Without even thinking, the killer raised their heavy-duty flashlight and smashed it into the side of Kim's head. Then they stomped on her back, breaking her neck. But the killer wasn't done. They knelt down, put the long metal flashlight against Kim's throat, and then pulled back on both ends, creating a makeshift garrote. They pulled as hard as they could, until Kim stopped moving. After she was dead, they dragged her body off the road and deep into the woods. There, they removed the handcuffs and hastily covered her body with loose branches and debris they found nearby. Then, the killer went home and meticulously cleaned their car, making sure there was no evidence that would tie them to the murder. But they didn't realize they had left behind one crucial, damning piece of evidence at the scene, that shoe print on Kim's sweatshirt. The print had a very distinct V-shaped pattern on its tread, which made it very easy for forensics to identify. Weeks later, the crime lab traced that print back to a specific shoe made by the Thorogood Company, a well-known supplier of military and uniform footwear. And that particular model of shoe happened to be the exact same one that was issued to every officer in the Monroe Public Safety Department. Kim's killer was not just posing as a police officer. They were a real police officer. The killer was Officer Josh Griffin, the off-duty rookie cop who claimed he had simply responded to a car in a ditch and then gone home a half an hour before Kim went missing. It would later turn out that Josh had learned all the details about Kim's vehicle and her late-night driving patterns from his own father, Officer Roger Griffin. After his father and Captain Simpson had responded to Kim's road rage complaint on March 15th, Roger had casually told his son about the incident. And from that moment, Josh had become obsessed. He had been on the lookout for Kim's Jeep ever since, just waiting for his chance. Josh Griffin was arrested on the 30th of May, 1997, about 2 months after Kim's murder. He was eventually convicted of first-degree kidnapping and first-degree murder and was sentenced to life in prison. As for his motive, the prosecution argued that he had become fixated on Kim after hearing about her from his father and, in an act of horrific violence, decided to abduct and kill her. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. We are taught from a very young age to fear the dark and to watch out for strangers lurking in the shadows. We lock our front doors at night to keep the bad guys out, and we tell ourselves that as long as we are inside our own homes, surrounded by our families, we are completely safe. But the absolute worst kind of terror is not the one that comes from a stranger in a dark alleyway. It is the terror that lives inside your own home, sharing meals with you, smiling at you across the dinner table, and pretending to care about your future. This is the story of a young woman named Elizabeth who lived in a quiet, normal-looking Austrian town called Amstetten, which is located about an hour west of the capital city of Vienna. Elizabeth was just 18 years old in the summer of 1984, and she was a young woman who had her whole life ahead of her. She was quiet, friendly, and she had big dreams of becoming a clothing designer. She loved fashion, she loved spending time with her friends, and more than anything, she wanted to experience the freedom of the outside world. But behind the walls of her family home, she was living a complete nightmare. Her father, a man named Joseph, was a highly successful electrical engineer and a prominent real estate developer in the town. To the neighbors and the local community, Joseph was a highly respected, hardworking family man who always waved when he saw people on the street. But once the front door of their house was shut, Joseph changed into a completely different person. He was a ruthless tyrant who ruled his family with an iron fist, and his wife and children lived in constant fear of his unpredictable temper. On the 28th of August, 1984, Elizabeth suddenly vanished. One moment she was there, and the next she was completely gone. Her mother, Rose Marie, was frantic with worry and immediately started asking friends and neighbors if they had seen her daughter, but nobody had any answers. On the very next day, when Elizabeth still had not come home and there was still no word from her, her parents walked into the local police station in Amstetten to report her missing. The police took the report seriously and began a search of the immediate area. They looked through the town, they searched the local parks, and they questioned people who knew Elizabeth, but they could not find a single clue. Weeks went by with absolutely no progress. Then, about a month after Elizabeth first disappeared, her parents came back to the police station. This time, they were carrying a letter. They told the officers that they had received this letter in the mail and that it was written by Elizabeth. The letter was postmarked from a town that was located about 2 hours west of Amstetten. In this note, Elizabeth wrote directly to her parents, telling them that she had grown incredibly tired of living with them. She wrote that she wanted to start a new life on her own, and she begged them not to come looking for her. She even added a warning saying that if she found out they were trying to search for her, she would immediately flee the country and they would never see her again. The police looked at the letter and asked the parents if they believed this was really their daughter's handwriting. The parents looked at the officers and said yes, they were absolutely sure it was her. At this point, Joseph stepped forward and suggested a theory. He told the investigators that he believed his daughter had run away to join some kind of religious cult. He claimed that before she went missing, she had been showing a lot of interest in these types of groups, and he was convinced she had finally made the decision to abandon her family to go live with them. And so, the police began to investigate this new lead. They went out and interviewed Elizabeth's close friends, her siblings, and other relatives to find out if she had ever mentioned anything about a cult. But the problem was, every single person they spoke to gave them the exact same answer. They all said there was absolutely no way Elizabeth would ever join a cult. They described her as a very down-to-earth, quiet person who had never shown the slightest interest in religion or alternative lifestyles. In fact, many of them said that the idea of Elizabeth joining a cult was completely ridiculous. This discrepancy made the police very suspicious. They felt like something was not adding up, and so they decided to look deeper into the history of the family. As they started digging, they uncovered the dark reality of what was happening behind the closed doors of the household. They learned that Joseph was an incredibly abusive and controlling father. Elizabeth was the only child in the family who was brave enough to stand up to him. Whenever Joseph would try to dominate the household, Elizabeth would fight back, which often resulted in massive, screaming arguments. To punish her for her defiance, Joseph would beat her severely and lock her in her room, refusing to let her see her friends or leave the house for long periods of time. He would also go through all of her private belongings, reading her personal diary, and monitoring every single move she made. The police also discovered that 2 years prior to this disappearance, in 1982, Elizabeth had actually tried to run away from home. She had made it all the way to Vienna before she was located and brought back. When the police learned about this previous escape attempt, they came to a logical conclusion. They figured that Elizabeth had simply grown tired of her father's severe abuse and had staged this latest disappearance to finally break free from him for good. Since she was now 18 years old and technically an adult, she had the legal right to leave her family if she wanted to. The police assumed that the letter she had sent was her way of telling everyone to leave her alone and that she was safe somewhere else. And so, because they believed this was a private family matter rather than a crime, the police stopped investigating. After a year had passed with no new developments, they officially closed the case, believing that Elizabeth was simply out there living her new life, free from her abusive father. But the truth was far more terrifying than anyone could have ever imagined. Fast forward 24 years to the 19th of April, 2008. The town of Amstetten was going about its normal business when a medical emergency occurred that would change everything. A 19-year-old girl named Kirsten was rushed to the local hospital in Amstetten. Kirsten was in an incredibly critical condition. Her skin was so pale that it looked almost completely transparent, and she was unconscious, suffering from severe seizures, lung failure, and kidney failure. The doctors immediately began working on her, and they managed to stabilize her condition by putting her into a medically induced coma. But the problem was they could not figure out what was causing her organs to fail. They ran a long list of tests, but the results were highly unusual, showing symptoms of a rare advanced medical condition that none of the doctors had ever seen in someone so young. They suspected that she might have some kind of rare genetic disorder, so they decided to look her up in the National Medical Database to see if she had any previous medical records or if there was any family history of this disease. But when they typed her name into the system, nothing came up. There was no record of Kirsten ever visiting a doctor, getting a vaccine, or even being born. This was highly unusual because in Austria, every single citizen is registered in the National Health Database from the moment they are born. The doctors assumed there must be a typo, so they checked other government databases, but her name did not appear anywhere. It was as if this 19-year-old girl did not exist on paper at all. The doctors were completely baffled by this situation. They knew that if they wanted to save this girl's life, they desperately needed to get some medical history. So they decided to walk out into the waiting room to speak with the man who had brought her to the hospital. When they approached him, they saw an older man who identified himself as Kirsten's grandfather. This man was none other than Joseph. But when the doctors started asking him basic questions about the girl's medical history, Joseph became incredibly defensive. He was rude, aggressive, and highly dismissive of the medical staff. Anytime they asked him about Kirsten's parents or if she had any pre-existing health issues, Joseph would give the shortest answers possible. He repeatedly claimed that he knew absolutely nothing about her health, and he demanded that they just do their jobs and heal her without asking so many questions. The doctors were shocked by his behavior. They could not understand why a grandfather would be so hostile and uncooperative when his granddaughter's life was hanging in the balance. It seemed very obvious to them that Joseph was hiding something, and his refusal to cooperate was putting the girl in extreme danger. Sensing that something was terribly wrong, the hospital staff decided they had no choice but to contact the police and report the suspicious behavior of this grandfather. When the police arrived at the hospital and saw Joseph standing in the waiting room, they immediately recognized him. He was the father of Elizabeth, the girl who had vanished 24 years earlier. The officers pulled Joseph aside and asked him to explain exactly what was going on. Joseph, realizing that he had to cooperate with the police to some extent, decided to tell them a highly bizarre story. He claimed that earlier that morning he had heard a noise at his front door. When he went to open it, he found Kirsten lying unconscious on his front doorstep. He said that next to her was a letter that was addressed to him, and that the letter was written by his missing daughter, Elizabeth. In this note, Elizabeth supposedly wrote that this young girl was her daughter, Kirsten, and that she was extremely sick. She wrote that she was unable to take care of her because of her own difficult circumstances, and she begged Joseph and Rosemary to take the girl to the hospital and raise her. The police read the note, and it looked very similar to the letters they had seen 24 years ago. But the whole situation felt incredibly suspicious. How could a woman who had been missing for over 2 decades suddenly drop an unconscious, critically ill teenager on her parents' doorstep and then just vanish into air again? The police knew they had to find Elizabeth if they wanted to get to the bottom of this. More importantly, the doctors told the police that without knowing the mother's medical history, they might not be able to save Kirsten's life. And so, the police decided to use the power of the media. They put out an urgent public appeal on television, radio, and in the newspapers. The message was directed specifically to Elizabeth, begging her to come forward and contact the hospital or the police, explaining that her daughter's life depended on her giving them information about her medical history. The public appeal worked. 1 week after the message was broadcast, a woman matching Elizabeth's description walked into the hospital accompanied by Joseph. When the doctors saw them, they immediately notified the police. But before the officers could arrive, the doctors had a chance to observe Elizabeth. They were absolutely shocked by her physical appearance. Elizabeth was supposed to be 42 years old, but she looked like she was in her late 60s. Her hair had turned completely white, and her skin was so pale that it was almost transparent, exactly like the skin of her sick daughter, Kirsten. She was hunched over, slouching down as if she was trying to make herself as small as possible, and she refused to make eye contact with anyone. She looked completely terrified. Joseph walked her into Kirsten's hospital room, where she stood by the bedside, looking down at her unconscious daughter. The doctors tried to ask her questions about Kirsten's health, but Elizabeth was so overwhelmed with fear that she could barely speak. She looked at Joseph constantly, as if she was waiting for his permission to say anything. The tension in the room was palpable. Sensing her immense terror, the doctors realized they were not going to get any answers while Joseph was standing right next to her. Shortly after, Joseph and Elizabeth walked out of the hospital room and into the hallway where the police were waiting for them. The officers immediately detained both of them and brought them to the police station for questioning. At the police station, the investigators decided to separate Joseph and Elizabeth. They put Elizabeth in a quiet interview room, but when they started asking her questions, she remained completely silent. She sat there, trembling, clutching her hands, and refused to say a single word. For 5 hours, the police patiently and persistently questioned her. They asked her where she had been for the last 24 years, why her daughter was so sick, and what her relationship was with her father. They tried to appeal to her as a mother, reminding her that her daughter Kirsten was in a coma and might not survive unless they got answers. They explained to her that if Kirsten died and it was discovered that she had withheld vital medical information, she could face serious criminal charges. Finally, after hours of silence, Elizabeth looked up at the investigators. In a very soft, trembling voice, she told them that she would tell them absolutely everything, but she had one condition. She made them promise solemnly that she would never, ever have to see her father, Joseph, again for the rest of her life. The police, seeing the sheer terror in her eyes, knew that she was telling the truth about her fear. They immediately agreed to her condition and promised her that they would keep her completely safe from her father. Elizabeth took a deep breath, clutched her hands together, and began to tell them a story so incredibly dark and horrifying that it would shock the entire world. She told them that it all started on the 28th of August, 1984, the day she was reported missing. On that afternoon, Elizabeth was at home when her father, Joseph, asked her to come down to the basement to help him with a project. Joseph had spent the last 6 years constructing what he claimed was a bomb shelter in the basement of their house. During the Cold War, it was not uncommon for people to build shelters in their homes, so nobody in the family thought anything of it. Joseph told Elizabeth that he had finally finished the shelter, but he just needed her help to install the final heavy steel door. Elizabeth, wanting to be helpful, followed him down the stairs. When they got to the basement, Joseph pointed to a heavy metal door frame and asked her to step inside the shelter and hold the door in place while he secured the hinges from the outside. Elizabeth did exactly what her father asked. She stepped through the frame and held the heavy metal door. But the moment she did, Joseph suddenly swung the door shut, knocking her backward onto the floor. Before she could realize what was happening or get back on her feet, Joseph rushed into the room and pressed a towel soaked in ether over her face. Elizabeth fought back, but the chemical fumes quickly overwhelmed her and she lost consciousness. When she finally woke up, she was lying on a cold floor in complete darkness. She tried to move, but she heard the sound of metal rattling. It turns out her father had chained her by her ankle to a post in the very back room of the shelter. She was trapped in the very place her father had spent 6 long years secretly building, not as a shelter to protect his family, but as a high-tech prison designed specifically to keep his daughter captive. The police were stunned as Elizabeth described the layout of this secret underground dungeon. Joseph, being a highly skilled electrical engineer, had designed the prison with terrifying precision. To access the bunker, you had to go down into the family's basement, which looked like a typical, cluttered, unfinished basement. On the far wall, there was a large set of wooden shelves filled with paint cans, tools, and typical household storage items. But this shelving unit was actually a disguise. If you walked over to the left side of the shelves and released a hidden lock, the entire shelving unit would swing open like a door. Behind it, built into the concrete wall, was a small, heavy steel door that was only about 3 feet tall. This secret door was secured with a high-tech electronic keypad lock. Since Joseph was an expert in electronics, he had wired the lock so that it could only be opened by entering a complex code that only he knew. He had also installed backup power systems and reinforced the entire area with thick concrete so that it was virtually impossible to break in or out. If you entered the correct code, the steel door would slide open, revealing a narrow, winding concrete passage. The ceilings of this underground prison were incredibly low, measuring only about 5.5 feet high, which meant that an average adult could not even stand up straight. As you walked down the soundproof hallway, you would first reach a tiny, windowless bathroom that was always freezing cold. Beyond that was another soundproof corridor that led into a series of incredibly cramped rooms. There was a tiny bedroom that barely had enough space for a single mattress and another small room adjacent to it. Joseph had lined the entire prison with thick soundproofing material and reinforced concrete, ensuring that no matter how loud Elizabeth screamed, not a single sound would ever reach the house upstairs or the neighbors outside. To make matters worse, Joseph had installed a closed-circuit television camera system throughout the dungeon, which allowed him to monitor Elizabeth's every move from a monitor in his private workshop upstairs. She had absolutely no privacy, no way to escape, and was completely at her father's mercy. For the first 5 years of her confinement, Elizabeth lived in complete and utter isolation. She had no access to natural light, fresh air, or any human contact other than her father. Joseph would come down to the basement almost every single night. To his wife, Rosemarie, and the rest of the family upstairs, Joseph would simply claim that he was going down to his workshop to work on his engineering projects, sometimes staying down there for hours. But in reality, he was going down to the dungeon to deliver a minimal amount of food and water to Elizabeth and to brutally assault her. The torment was relentless, and Elizabeth was forced to endure it night after night, with no hope of rescue. In 1988, Elizabeth discovered that she was pregnant with her father's child. Terrified of the prospect of giving birth in the dark, cramped dungeon, she begged Joseph to let her go to a hospital or to bring a doctor down to help her. But Joseph absolutely refused. He knew that any contact with the outside world would expose his horrific secret. Instead, he tossed her a medical book about childbirth, a pair of scissors to cut the umbilical cord, and some basic disinfectant, telling her that she would have to figure it out on her own. And so, on the 30th of August 1988, Elizabeth gave birth to her first child, Kirsten, entirely alone on the dirty floor of the underground prison. Over the next several years, Elizabeth would go on to deliver 6 more of her father's children in that very same basement. Each birth was a terrifying ordeal, experienced in complete darkness and isolation, with only the medical book to guide her. In 1996, Elizabeth gave birth to a baby boy named Michael. He was born with severe respiratory problems and struggled to breathe from the very beginning. He was struggling to breathe, and his condition was rapidly worsening. Elizabeth, desperate to save her newborn baby's life, begged and pleaded with Joseph to take him to a hospital. She cried, telling him that the baby would die without medical attention. But once again, Joseph's only concern was protecting himself. He flatly refused to help. 3 days after his birth, baby Michael passed away in Elizabeth's arms. But the horror did not stop there. Instead of showing any remorse or allowing Elizabeth to grieve, Joseph took the infant's lifeless body, carried it upstairs, and threw it into the home's coal-burning heating stove, incinerating the body completely to erase any physical evidence of the baby's existence. As the years went on, the remaining 6 children were growing older and larger. The cramped underground bunker, which was already tiny, was becoming increasingly crowded and noisy. Joseph realized that as the children grew, the risk of someone hearing them or discovering the secret entrance was becoming too high. And so, he came up with a highly elaborate and manipulative plan to solve this problem. He decided that he would take some of the children upstairs to live with him and his wife, Rose Marie, while leaving the others downstairs in the dark with Elizabeth. To prepare for this, Joseph went down into the dungeon and took one of Elizabeth's youngest children away from her. When Elizabeth tried to fight back and keep her baby, Joseph threatened her and the remaining children. He told them that he had rigged the basement with a system that could easily seal off all the ventilation and pump in lethal gas. He swore that if they ever tried to escape, if they made too much noise, or if they fought him when he took a child, he would turn on the gas and kill them all. Elizabeth knew her father was a ruthless man who was entirely capable of carrying out this threat, especially after how he had treated baby Michael. So, she was forced to let him take her child away. Joseph carried the baby upstairs, and then he set up a highly calculated scene. He placed the baby on his own front doorstep and went back inside. A short while later, he pretended to discover the baby on the step. He showed the infant to his wife, Rose Marie, and presented her with a letter. This letter, which he had forced Elizabeth to write and sign under threat of death, stated that Elizabeth had given birth to a child, but was completely unable to care for it due to her life in a cult. The letter begged her parents to take the baby in and raise it as their own. Rose Marie, who had been completely brainwashed and abused by Joseph for decades, believed the story without question. Over the next several years, Joseph repeated this exact same process 2 more times, taking 2 more of Elizabeth's young children from the basement and staging their discovery on the front porch with forged notes. In the end, 3 of the children, Lisa, Monica, and Alexander, were raised upstairs in the warmth of the sun by Joseph and Rose Marie, believing that they had been abandoned by a mother who did not want them. Meanwhile, the other 3 children, Kirsten, Stefan, and Felix, remained trapped in the pitch-black dungeon below, completely unaware that the sun existed, or that their own siblings were living normal lives directly above their heads. The contrast between the 2 lives was heartbreaking. While the upstairs children went to school, played in the yard, and made friends, the downstairs children lived a life of absolute deprivation. Elizabeth did everything in her power to give them some semblance of a normal life. She used the few books Joseph allowed them to have to teach them how to read and write. She spent hours talking to them, explaining what the outside world was like, what trees looked like, and how the sun felt on your skin. Eventually, Joseph provided them with a small television and a radio. Elizabeth used these devices as educational tools, showing her children programs about nature, science, and history, promising them that one day they would finally get to leave the concrete walls and see the real world for themselves. But the physical toll of living in a windowless, unventilated concrete box was severe. The children suffered from chronic health issues, joint pain, and severe dental problems. They had never felt a breeze, never run on grass, and had never received a single medical checkup. But the problem was, Joseph was not just keeping this secret from his wife. Over the 24 years that Elizabeth was kept in the basement, Joseph actually rented out rooms in the upper floors of his house to more than 100 different tenants. These tenants lived, slept, and ate in the very same house, completely unaware that a family was trapped in a concrete dungeon directly beneath their feet. None of them ever reported hearing anything unusual, mostly because the concrete walls and soundproofing were so thick. However, there was one particular tenant who lived in the house for a 4-year period during the late 90s. This tenant had a medium-sized dog that stayed with him in his rented room. The tenant would later tell the police that almost every single night, at some point, the dog would suddenly freeze. Its ears would perk up, its tail would go stiff, and it would look down at the floorboards and begin to growl softly. The tenant thought this behavior was very strange, and at first, he would get up and look around the room, thinking there might be a mouse or some kind of pest in the walls. But he never found anything, and so after a while, he just dismissed the dog's behavior, assuming it was just reacting to normal settling noises of the old house. It was only after the horrific truth was finally revealed that the tenant realized his dog had actually been hearing the faint, muffled sounds of Elizabeth and her children moving around in the dark directly beneath his room. When the police completed their interviews with Elizabeth, they were completely horrified. They immediately went to the house in Amstetten to search the basement. They found the hidden mechanism behind the shelving unit, entered the code that Joseph had been forced to provide, and stepped into the secret bunker. There, they found the two remaining children, Stefan and Felix, who were still locked inside. When the officers brought them out into the sunlight for the very first time, the youngest child, who was only 5 years old, was completely mesmerized. As they drove him to the hospital, he pressed his face against the car window, staring in absolute awe at the trees, the cars, and the sky. He had never seen anything like it in his entire life. The police also launched a massive investigation into the mother, Rosemarie, to determine if she had been an accomplice to Joseph's crimes. They found it hard to believe that a wife could live in the same house for 24 years and have 3 abandoned babies show up on her doorstep without ever realizing what her husband was doing in the basement. But after conducting extensive psychological evaluations and interviewing neighbors, relatives, and Elizabeth herself, the police officially ruled Rosemarie out as a suspect. It turns out that Rosemarie was also a victim of Joseph's extreme violence and psychological control. Joseph had severely abused her from the very beginning of their marriage when she was only 17. He had created an environment of total terror, forbidding her from ever going near his private workshop or the basement. Whenever she asked questions, he would threaten her with violence. She had been so thoroughly broken by his abuse that she simply did not dare to question his explanations, choosing instead to accept whatever lies he told her in order to survive. The trial of Joseph Fritzl began in March 2009 inches, the town of St. Polten. The media coverage was intense, with journalists from all over the world descending on the quiet Austrian town to cover what was being called one of the worst cases of domestic abuse and imprisonment in modern history. The prosecution presented a massive amount of evidence, including the physical layout of the bunker, the video surveillance equipment, the letters Joseph had forced Elizabeth to write, and a detailed video testimony from Elizabeth herself, which was played in a closed courtroom to protect her privacy. Joseph initially tried to plead not guilty to some of the charges, particularly the charge of murder regarding the infant Michael who had died in the basement. But when he was forced to watch Elizabeth's emotional, hours-long video testimony, he broke down in tears. Realizing that there was absolutely no escape from the overwhelming evidence against him, Joseph changed his plea to guilty on all charges, including murder by negligence, rape, incest, false imprisonment, and enslavement. The judge sentenced him to life imprisonment in a high-security psychiatric facility. Today, Joseph remains behind bars, and he is one of the most notorious and deeply despised inmates in the entire Austrian prison system. The other prisoners hold an intense hatred for him because of the horrific nature of his crimes against his own daughter and children. In 2016, during a brief period when he was allowed into the general population yard, Joseph was brutally attacked by several inmates. They beat him severely, knocking out several of his teeth before prison guards could intervene. Following this incident, prison officials realized that if Joseph was left in the general population, he would almost certainly be killed. As a result, he was placed in protective custody, spending nearly 24 hours a day in an isolated cell, completely cut off from other inmates. It is a striking twist of fate that the man who spent 24 years trapping his daughter in a tiny, dark concrete box is now spending the remainder of his natural life trapped in a small, isolated prison cell. Under Austrian law, Joseph became eligible to apply for parole in 2024 at the age of 89. But legal experts agree that due to the severity of its crimes and a psychiatric evaluation, he will almost certainly spend the rest of his life behind bars. As for Elizabeth and her 6 surviving children, their road to recovery was incredibly long and difficult. After being freed, they were all taken to a specialized clinic where they received extensive medical treatment and psychological therapy to help them adjust to the outside world. The children had to be taught how to walk properly on flat surfaces, as their joints had been affected by the low ceilings of the bunker. They also had to undergo physical therapy to help their eyes adjust to natural sunlight. But despite the immense trauma they had experienced, the family showed incredible resilience. The Austrian government took extraordinary measures to protect their privacy, granting them entirely new identities, new names, and relocation to an undisclosed village in the Austrian countryside. They were provided with a secure home equipped with security systems to prevent the paparazzi from finding them. Today, they live a completely quiet and private life. While there are very few updates about their current status, local sources have occasionally reported that the children have successfully integrated into society. They have made friends, attended school, and are finally experiencing the ordinary, beautiful things in life that were stolen from them for so long. Elizabeth, who spent her youth in the dark, is finally able to watch her children grow up in the warmth of the sun, living the life of freedom she always dreamed of. We often think of home as a sanctuary, a place where the doors are locked to keep the evils of the world outside. We look at the people we love, our parents, our guardians, the ones who are supposed to protect us, and we place our absolute trust in them. But this story serves as a haunting reminder of how easily the concept of family can be twisted into something unthinkably monstrous. For 24 years, the real world moved on just above a thin layer of concrete. Neighbors mowed their lawns, children played in the street, and tenants slept peacefully, all while a young woman and her children were kept in a silent, soundproof tomb, completely forgotten by the system. The sheer willpower of Elizabeth, who kept her children alive, educated them, and gave them hope in a windowless concrete cell, is a testament to the strength of a mother's love under the most extreme conditions. Her father tried to erase her humanity and make her his property, but he ultimately failed because she never let her children lose their sense of wonder. They survived the dark, and they finally walked out into the light. We're taught to fear strangers, but sometimes the real danger lives much closer. In a place we call home. In someone we're supposed to trust. This story is a reminder that trust, once broken, doesn't just disappear, it leaves something behind that never truly heals. Until next time, stay aware. Sometimes we think we have a solid grip on how the world works. We wake up, we go about our normal routines, and we assume that the rules of reality will keep everything in its proper place. We trust our senses, we trust our minds, and we trust that the environments we step into will behave in predictable ways. But every now and then, the universe decides to throw those rules completely out the window. Today, we are going to look at 3 incredible stories that demonstrate just how bizarre, unpredictable, and downright terrifying life can be when the ordinary suddenly collides with the impossible. These are stories about real people who found themselves in situations that sound like they were pulled straight from a Hollywood movie. But every single one of these events actually happened, and the details will leave you questioning how much we truly know about the world around us. From a chaotic clash of identities on the streets of Detroit, to a mysterious voice that acted as a guardian angel in London, and finally to a man who defied the laws of probability in the dark waters of the Atlantic, these stories show us that reality is often much stranger than fiction. Our first story takes us to the city of Detroit, Michigan, specifically to the east side of the city on Andover Street. If you were to ask anyone who lives in this neighborhood, they would tell you right away that Andover Street has a reputation. It is an area that has been heavily affected by drug activity for a very long time. Because of this, the local police department is constantly running operations to try and clean up the streets and keep the community safe. On a cold Thursday morning, specifically November 9th, 2017, two special operations officers from the Detroit Police Department were getting ready to start a specific type of undercover operation known as a push-off. Now, if you are not familiar with what a push-off is, it is basically a reverse sting operation. Undercover police officers will set themselves up in an area, usually in a house, that is known for drug transactions, and they will pretend to be the local drug dealers. When unsuspecting customers walk up to the house trying to buy drugs, the undercover officers will invite them inside, wait for them to make a verbal request to purchase illegal substances, and then immediately arrest them and seize their vehicles. These two particular special operations officers had been working deep undercover in this specific neighborhood for quite a while. Because they had been there so long, they had a very specific local drug house that they had secured and set up for this exact operation. They arrived at the house, got themselves in character, and began to wait. Meanwhile, not too far away, another unit from a completely different police precinct was planning their own drug enforcement operation for that very same day. This second unit consisted of a group of undercover officers who were running a buy-bust operation. A buy-bust is the exact opposite of a push-off. In a buy-bust, undercover officers pretend to be drug buyers. They walk around the neighborhood, look for active drug houses, and attempt to buy illegal substances from real drug dealers. Once the transaction is initiated, they signal their backup team to swoop in and make the arrest. But the problem was that there was a massive breakdown in communication between the two different police precincts. Neither group had any idea that the other group was operating on Andover Street that morning. It was a classic bureaucratic oversight, but on the streets, it was a recipe for disaster. Around midday, two undercover officers from the 2nd Precinct were walking down Andover Street looking for active drug houses. They saw the house where the first two undercover officers were waiting. To the officers from the 2nd Precinct, this house looked exactly like a real active drug house, and to the officers inside, the two men walking up to the porch looked exactly like typical drug customers. The two undercover buyers walked up the steps and knocked on the front door. The undercover officers inside opened the door, looked them over, and in accordance with their training, invited them inside. The buyers walked in and sat down in the living room. The undercover officers, acting as dealers, asked them what they were looking for. The buyers then asked if they could purchase some drugs. As soon as those words left their mouths, the undercover officers, acting as dealers, whipped out their police badges, drew their service weapons, and ordered the two men to get on the ground. But instead of complying, the two buyers did something that absolutely shocked the dealers. They also whipped out their police badges, drew their service weapons, and yelled back that no, they were the ones who needed to get on the ground. At this point, both groups of officers were standing in a freezing, high-tension standoff. Neither side believed the other side was actually telling the truth. In the high-stakes world of undercover operations, criminals will often pose as police officers to rob rival dealers or escape arrest. So, the officers from the 1st Precinct were convinced that these two buyers were actually armed criminals using fake police badges. And the officers from the 2nd Precinct were convinced that the dealers were criminals trying to rip them off with fake badges of their own. They stood there, guns pointed at each other, in a tense standoff that looked exactly like that famous scene from The Office, where everyone is pointing a gun at everyone else, trying to figure out who the double agent is. They began periodically hurling insults and threats at each other, trying to force the other side to stand down. But nobody was backing down. The tension in the room was boiling over, and both sides were terrified that if they fired a shot, it would end in a bloodbath. But instead of pulling their triggers, when neither side stood down, they all eventually lowered their weapons. But they did not talk it out. Instead, they lunged at each other and proceeded to beat the living crap out of each other. A massive, chaotic fistfight broke out right there in the living room. Within moments, the backup officers from both precincts, who had been waiting nearby in unmarked vehicles, saw the commotion and rushed into the house. But instead of breaking up the fight, they also got confused and joined in. It turned into a massive brawl of police officers fighting other police officers, with punches flying, furniture breaking, and complete chaos taking over the house. After the dust finally settled and the haymakers had stopped, someone finally managed to get a radio transmission through, and the two groups of police suddenly realized the monumental mistake they had just made. They immediately stopped fighting and began to apologize to one another, nursing their bruises and panting for air. Luckily, none of the officers were critically injured in this bizarre mix-up. However, two officers did have to be taken to the hospital for treatment, though fortunately their injuries were very minor. One officer ended up with a massive black eye, and another had a split lip. When the news of this incident got out, Detroit's own chief of police, along with the media and the public at large, all came out and said that this entire snafu was a total embarrassment for the department. It showed a clear lack of coordination and communication. But, on the other hand, some people argued that the officers involved actually deserved a little bit of credit. After all, their job was to be undercover. And they were apparently so incredibly good at being undercover that they were able to completely fool other trained professional police officers who were looking for the exact same things. It turns out they were just too good at their jobs, but you can be the judge of that. Our next story was pulled from a 1997 article published in the prestigious British medical journal, The Show. This article was written by a psychiatrist who personally treated the patient, who will be the focal point of this story. The only reason we bring this up right at the beginning is because this story sounds so completely made up that if it were not documented in an official, peer-reviewed medical journal, it would be almost impossible to believe. One night in the cold winter of 1984, a healthy, middle-aged woman, who we will call Brenda for the sake of this story, was sitting in her quiet home in London, England. It was a completely normal, peaceful evening. Brenda was sitting on her couch, enjoying the quiet warmth of her living room and reading a book. But as she was reading, she suddenly heard a voice speak directly in her head. The voice did not sound like her own thoughts, and it did not sound like it was coming from the room around her. It was a distinct, clear, calm voice that spoke directly into her mind. The voice said, "Please do not be afraid." I know this must be shocking for you to hear me speaking to you like this, but this was the easiest way I could think of. My friend and we used to work at the Children's Hospital, and we would like to help you. Brenda sat frozen on her couch. She could not believe what was happening. She had absolutely no history of mental illness, she had never heard voices in her head before, and she was a completely rational, healthy person. The voice she was hearing was so incredibly clear, and it did not sound like any voice she had ever heard in her real life. At first, Brenda did not do anything. She just sat there on the couch holding her book, waiting and hoping that this was just some strange, fleeting trick of her mind. But the voice in her head seemed to pick up on her internal panic. The voice spoke again and said, "Brenda, this is not a hallucination. We are real, and we want to help you." Brenda did not believe the voice was real. She was absolutely convinced that she had just lost her mind and was experiencing some kind of sudden, severe mental breakdown. For the rest of the night, she did her absolute best to completely ignore the voice in her head, trying to focus on anything else. First thing the next morning, Brenda went to her doctor's office, explained what was happening, and begged them for help. The doctor was very concerned and immediately referred her to a local psychiatrist. Brenda went over to the psychiatrist's office, and they performed a thorough psychological evaluation. After talking with her, the psychiatrist admitted that they did not really know why she was suddenly hearing these voices, There was absolutely no clear medical explanation or typical trigger for why a healthy, middle-aged woman with no history of mental issues would suddenly start hearing clear, distinct voices. So Brenda was ultimately diagnosed with a rare condition called functional hallucinatory psychosis. This diagnosis basically meant that Brenda was indeed hallucinating, but there was no clear physical or psychological reason why it was happening. The psychiatrist began treating Brenda with a strong antipsychotic drug, and they also set up regular supportive counseling sessions. Over the next couple of weeks, Brenda was incredibly diligent. She took her medications exactly as prescribed, and she never missed a single appointment. And slowly but surely, the voices in her mind began to fade, and eventually they stopped completely. Brenda was overjoyed. She went back into her psychiatrist's office, looked at him, and said, "Doctor, you have saved me. The voices are completely gone, and I am so happy." The psychiatrist would later write in his medical journal that Brenda was visibly relieved during this appointment. It was completely obvious to him that she was not making any of this up. She had really believed she was hearing these voices, she had been terrified by them, and now she was profoundly grateful to have her life back to normal. After leaving the office, Brenda decided that she and her family needed to celebrate. They decided to go on a vacation outside of London just to relax and enjoy the fact that she had not, in fact, lost her mind. But while they were away on holiday, enjoying the peaceful countryside, the nightmare returned. Brenda suddenly heard the voices in her head again. But this time, the tone was different. It was urgent. The voices told her that she had to get back to London as soon as possible because there was something terribly wrong with her. Along with this warning, the voices did something even more bizarre. They gave her a very specific street address in London that she was supposed to go to in order to seek immediate treatment. Brenda was absolutely horrified. She was devastated that the voices were back after she thought she was cured, but she was also incredibly scared by the specific nature of what they were saying. She began to wonder if maybe, just maybe, there was some terrifying truth to what these voices were telling her. What if there really was something horribly wrong with her body? Brenda ran to her husband crying and explained everything that had just happened. Her husband was a very loving and reassuring man. He held her and told her that she should just try to totally ignore the voices again. He pointed out that they had gone away before with medication, and there was probably nothing physically wrong with her. He urged her to just try to relax and enjoy the rest of their vacation. But Brenda could not relax. No matter what her husband said, she could not ignore the voices because they were constantly speaking to her now, repeating the same urgent message over and over again. They kept saying, "You need to leave, you need to go back, there is something wrong with you." Finally, unable to bear the constant mental pressure, Brenda convinced her family to end their vacation early, pack up their things, and head back to London. As soon as they arrived in the city, Brenda made her husband get in the car with her, and they drove straight to the exact street address the voices had given her. When they arrived and stepped out of the car, they found themselves standing right in front of the brain scan unit of a London hospital. Brenda and her husband stood on the pavement, completely shocked. They had never been to this building before, and Brenda had no prior knowledge of this specific medical facility or its address. But before they could even begin to process the sheer impossibility of what they were looking at, the voices in Brenda's head came back with absolute clarity. They told her that she needed to go inside the building immediately and request a brain scan for two very specific reasons. First, they said there was a tumor in her brain. Second, they said this tumor was causing her brain stem to swell. At first, Brenda went inside the brain scan facility and requested an immediate scan, honestly admitting to the reception staff that voices in her head had directed her to this exact address. Because she had no official doctor referral, the hospital had to turn her away, leaving Brenda in a state of absolute panic. She immediately called her psychiatrist, explaining how the voices had guided her to this real medical building. The psychiatrist was highly skeptical but agreed to order the scan anyway, solely to put her mind at ease. A month later, Brenda had the scan done, and the results completely shocked the entire medical community. The scan revealed she indeed had a brain tumor, and her brain stem was swollen, despite her showing absolutely no physical symptoms. After consulting her family, Brenda chose immediate surgery. As soon as she made the decision, the voices told her she had made the right choice. The surgery was a total success. In the recovery room, the voices spoke to her one last time, saying they were pleased to have helped her and said goodbye. Brenda never heard them again. To this day, the medical community still has no explanation for who or what those voices in Brenda's head really were. Our final story is about a man named Michael Packard, who might be either the luckiest or unluckiest person alive, depending on how you look at his incredible life. In 2001, when Michael was 38 years old, he survived a horrific plane crash over the jungles of Costa Rica that tragically killed the pilot, co-pilot, and another passenger on impact. Michael and 4 other survivors were left badly injured and stranded in the extremely remote wilderness for 48 agonizing hours before search and rescue teams finally reached them. Doctors later told him he would not have survived another night in the jungle. Over the next 2 decades, Michael, a commercial diver by trade, survived 2 separate great white shark encounters off California, got lost at sea for hours in the open ocean before being miraculously rescued, and even discovered a long-time missing person's body 60 feet underwater off the coast of Massachusetts. But absolutely none of these events compare to what happened to him on the morning of June 11th, 2021, when he experienced a 1 in a trillion event that baffled scientists around the world. On that peaceful summer morning, the 57-year-old Michael climbed into his boat with his longtime diving partner Josiah, heading out off the coast of Cape Cod to do some lobster diving. Around 8 in the morning, after successfully gathering about 100 pounds of lobsters, Michael decided to go down for one final dive. Josiah watched from the boat as Michael disappeared below the surface of the calm water. Suddenly, Josiah saw a massive, violent eruption of white water where Michael had just submerged, followed by a dark shadow moving rapidly below. Michael had been descending to 60 feet when, at about 45 feet, something hit him from behind like a freight train, immediately plunging him into total darkness and knocking his mouthpiece out. Fumbling around in panic, Michael felt soft, warm, quivering, muscular walls that were actively pulsating. He managed to find his regulator, took a deep breath, and realized there were no sharp teeth, meaning he was not inside a shark. He had actually been scooped up by a giant humpback whale. Humpback whales only eat very small fish, and when this whale realized it had accidentally swallowed a human and a heavy metal scuba tank, it began violently shaking its head side to side to eject him. This thrashing was what caused the dramatic eruption of water Josiah saw from the boat. After 45 agonizing seconds inside the whale's mouth, Michael was finally spat back out into the open water. He swam directly to the surface, saw the whale's tail fins swimming away, and was pulled to safety by Josiah. Miraculously, Michael suffered only minor bruising on his legs and was released from the hospital that very same afternoon. He remained incredibly casual about the encounter, telling reporters he could not wait to heal up and get back to lobster diving. These 3 stories, as different as they are, remind us of a powerful truth. We live our lives under the illusion of control, believing our minds, our identities, and our natural world are completely predictable. But whether it is undercover police officers clashing on a Detroit street, a mysterious voice pointing to a silent brain tumor in London, or a commercial diver being swallowed by a gentle giant of the deep off Cape Cod, we are always just one moment away from the completely unbelievable. These events show us that the division between reality and fiction is incredibly thin, and sometimes the strangest mysteries are the ones that actually happen. They leave us with a lingering sense of wonder and a reminder that no matter how much we plan, the universe will always find a way to surprise us. So perhaps the real question is not whether these stories are true or not, but how many similar stories exist that we will never hear about. Because the truth is, moments like these come without warning. They don't follow the rules. And when they happen, they change everything. If you've made it this far, you already know reality is unfair. See you in the next story. Robert Nishimoto was 71 years old, and he was the kind of person who really appreciated the quiet, simple moments in life. He spent most of his professional career working as a professor of sociology at the University of Southern California. For decades, he was deeply dedicated to his students, his research, and the university community. But when the time finally came for him to retire, he knew exactly where he wanted to spend the rest of his days. Robert decided to move back home to Hawaii. He wanted to spend his twilight years close to his friends and family, enjoying the beautiful tropical breeze, the warm sun, and the peaceful, slow pace of island life. He bought a lovely home with a large backyard and settled into a comfortable, happy routine. On Saturday, November 2nd, 2019, Robert woke up feeling particularly motivated. He looked out his window at his backyard and decided that today was the day he was going to tackle a major outdoor project he had been putting off for a while. His front lawn and the main part of his grass were in excellent shape because he took care of them on a regular basis. But the very back of his property had become completely overgrown. It was a wild mess of thick bushes, heavy shrubs, and tall trees that had not been trimmed in a very long time. Robert figured that on this beautiful Saturday morning, he would head out there and finally clean all of it up. So, he went to his tool shed, gathered up his pruning shears, his handsaw, his gardening gloves, and his other yard working tools, and walked out to the back of his property to get to work. Throughout the day, his neighbors saw him out there. They watched him slowly making progress, hacking his way through the thick branches and clearing out the dense weeds. By the evening, it looked like he was almost finished with the massive job. He had done an incredible amount of physical work, and everything seemed perfectly normal. He waved to a neighbor, packed up some of his things, and went about his evening. But fast forward 2 days later, to Monday, November 4th, Robert had a close group of friends that he met with all the time. On this particular Monday, his friends were sitting at their favorite restaurant in town, waiting for Robert to show up for lunch. This lunch meeting was a regular routine for them, and they always looked forward to catching up. But as the clock ticked past their scheduled meeting time, Robert was nowhere to be seen. One of his friends pulled out his phone and sent Robert a quick text message asking where he was. There was no reply. They waited and waited, watching the door, but Robert never walked in. After waiting for almost an hour and a half at the table, his friends started to get really worried. You see, Robert was not the type of guy who would ever blow off a lunch meeting without telling anyone. He was incredibly reliable and valued his friendships deeply. In fact, he was usually the first person to show up at the restaurant, and he would often tease the others for being even a few minutes late. For him to just not show up and not answer his phone was completely out of character and highly alarming. So the friends decided they would get in their cars and drive by Robert's house just to make sure he was doing okay. But as they turned onto his street, they realized something was very wrong. Down at the end of the road, right in front of Robert's house, there were fire trucks, police cars, and a massive amount of commotion. It turned out that nobody had seen or heard from Robert since Saturday evening when he was out in his yard. His family had been trying to call him all weekend to check in, but they could not get a hold of him. Their calls went straight to voicemail, and their texts went unread. Finally, on Monday, right around the time his friends were waiting at the restaurant, Robert's family had called the local police department to ask them to do a welfare check on him. When the police officer arrived at the house, he walked up to the front door and knocked loudly. There was no answer. He tried the door handle, but it was locked tight. So the officer walked around to the side of the house and made his way into the backyard, searching for any signs of life. He walked up to the back door and knocked again. Still, there was no answer. But as the officer stood there, he noticed that the back door was actually slightly open, leaving a small gap. He pushed the door open, stepped onto the threshold, and yelled inside, calling out Robert's name. No one replied. The officer decided to step inside to look around and make sure Robert was not hurt or in need of emergency medical help. He walked through the home, going room by room, checking the kitchen, the living room, and the bedrooms. Everything was neat and tidy, just as Robert always kept it. There was no sign of a struggle, no indication of a break-in, and absolutely no sign of Robert. The officer went back out the back door and stood in the yard, looking around the property. He decided to walk toward the very back of the yard where Robert had been clearing the brush. As he approached the edge of the cleared area, he noticed that some of Robert's yard tools were just lying flat on the grass, as if they had been dropped suddenly. And right next to those tools, there was a strange indentation in the ground. It looked like a small, shallow divot, as if the soil had sunk slightly. The officer was intrigued and a bit concerned, so he started walking across the lawn toward the tools and the divot. As he got closer, he noticed there was a tiny, dark hole right in the center of that indentation. The officer walked up to the very edge of the divot and peered down into the tiny hole, trying to see what was underneath. And then, without any warning, the ground beneath his feet began to give way. The earth collapsed inward, and the tiny hole suddenly turned into a wide, gaping opening about 2 feet across. The officer reacted on pure instinct, jumping backward to keep from falling into the sudden void. He stood there for a moment, his heart pounding, waiting for the ground to stop sliding and settling. Once everything was completely still, he cautiously crept back to the edge of the hole. He took out his flashlight, turned it on, and shone the beam down into the opening. But the light just faded into the darkness. He could not see the bottom at all. It was clear that this was an incredibly deep, vertical shaft. The officer carefully took a few more steps forward, testing the ground with his boots to make sure it was solid and would not collapse under his weight. Finally, he got to a spot where he could aim his lights straight down. And that was when his flashlight beam hit the bottom, 22 feet below. Lying there on the floor of the dark chamber was Robert's body. It turned out that Robert had fallen into a hidden lava tube. In big cities, people might worry about falling into open manholes, but in certain parts of Hawaii, the real danger is falling into lava tubes. These tubes are formed during volcanic eruptions. As hot, molten lava flows down the side of a volcano, the top layer of the lava is exposed to the air. That top layer begins to cool and harden, forming a solid crust or shell over the flowing lava underneath. The lava underneath keeps moving, sometimes for months, until it completely drains out. When it is empty, it leaves behind a massive, hollow subterranean tunnel. Over decades and centuries, nature reclaims the land on top of these tubes. Grass, bushes, and trees grow over them, making the ground look completely solid and normal. But right beneath that thin crust of earth is a giant, empty space. Robert had fallen through what is known as a skylight. A skylight is a place where the thin ceiling of a lava tube has weakened over time and left a small hole. In highly populated or touristy areas of Hawaii, these skylights are well known, clearly marked, and blocked off so people do not fall in. But if you go off the beaten path into areas that do not get much foot traffic, you can easily run into an undiscovered skylight. And in Robert's case, his backyard was so overgrown with thick brush and plants that the greenery had completely covered the hole. To Robert, it looked like he was standing on solid ground. In reality, he was standing on a fragile shelf of dirt and roots over a 22-foot drop. While he was working, the ground simply gave way, and he fell to his death. It was a tragic and sudden end to a peaceful retirement. Now, we are going to move from the quiet islands of Hawaii to the deep blue waters off the coast of the Dominican Republic, where we find another individual who pushed the limits of where humans are supposed to go. Her name was Audrey Mestre. Audrey was 28 years old, a French native, and she was one of the most talented free divers in the entire world. Freediving is already considered one of the most dangerous and extreme sports on the planet. For most people, freediving just means swimming underwater without a scuba tank. But for elite athletes like Audrey, it is a completely different world. They take a single massive breath of air on the surface, and then they dive down to mind-boggling depths, staying underwater for minutes at a time before returning to the surface. Within this already extreme sport, there is an even more extreme version called no limits. Instead of the diver taking a big gulp of air and then using their own physical strength to swim down or pull themselves down on a rope, in no limits free diving, the divers are allowed to use whatever equipment they want to get as deep as they can possibly handle. The only rule is that you cannot use a breathing apparatus. The most common no-limits technique is to grab hold of a heavy metal sled that is connected to a bottom-weighted vertical cable. The free diver holds onto the sled, and it is released from the surface. The sled rockets down into the deep ocean to whatever their desired depth is, and the diver just holds on tight. Once they reach the bottom of their descent, the diver turns a switch or a valve which shoots compressed air into a big balloon attached to the sled. Once the balloon is filled enough, the buoyancy pulls the sled and the diver, who is hanging on, back up the cable to the surface. Normally, a no-limits freedive using this technique takes approximately 3 minutes from start to finish. The reason no limits is considered such an extreme version of freediving is because it allows divers to reach extraordinary depths that they physically are not capable of getting to on their own. We are talking about over 100 meters below the surface. There is just no way a person can swim down that deep and back up on a single breath of air without the help of the sled and the balloon. Because of this, if your equipment fails at those extreme depths, it is almost always fatal. On October 12, 2002, Audrey was sitting on a floating platform off the coast of the Dominican Republic, mentally preparing herself for what she was about to do. She was trying to become the best free diver in the world by breaking the world record for the deepest depth achieved by a no-limits free diver, which was 170 meters. That record was actually held by her husband, a famous diver named Pippin Ferraris. But as she sat on that platform, doubt must have crept into her mind because storm clouds began to roll in and the water became rough. In the world of no-limits freediving, where so many things can go wrong, there is no reason to add in another risk factor like bad weather. It could affect the support team on the surface, and it could affect the stability of the cable. On top of that, Audrey was using a new piece of equipment. She had a slightly thinner, lighter cable that her sled was attached to, but she did not know how it would perform on a dive this deep. Furthermore, Pippin, who was in charge of safety for the dive, had been heavily criticized in the diving community. Many felt he was rushing this record attempt and had not done enough preparations. There were not enough medical staff on site, and there were not enough standby divers positioned along the cable. Audrey was well aware of these criticisms. Pippin was regularly criticized because 6 years earlier, 2 separate people on his staff had died during different diving accidents, and people accused him of being reckless. But despite all of these red flags, Audrey was incredibly confident and wanted to go through with the dive. She signaled to her team that she was ready. She zipped up her bright yellow wetsuit, checked her sensors and video cameras, and put on her long fins. Meanwhile, Pippin checked the crucial balloon that would bring her back up. Because this piece of equipment was so vital, Pippin insisted that he was the only one who could touch it, even though normal safety procedures required at least 2 other people to inspect it before a dive. Regardless, Pippin inspected the balloon and determined it was good to go. He signaled to Audrey and she slipped off the platform into the water, swimming over to the 200-pound sled. Just before she gave the final go-ahead, she performed a procedure called packing, taking a deep breath and gulping down extra air to pack her lungs full. Then, she gave the signal. The sled was released, and she began rocketing down into the deep ocean. Audrey's descent was going perfectly until she hit the 164-meter mark. Because of the bad weather and rough water, the lightweight cable was swaying in the current, causing kinks to form in the line. The sled caught on one of these kinks and stopped. Audrey had to sit there in the dark for 30 seconds until the kink finally straightened out and she could continue down past the record mark of 170 meters. That 30-second delay might not have mattered if everything else went perfectly, but unfortunately, it did not. Once Audrey set the record by hitting 171 meters, she stopped the sled and reached over to turn the valve to inflate the balloon. She turned the switch, but nothing happened. The balloon did not inflate. On the camera footage, you can see a hint of panic in her body language. She was almost out of breath, pushing past her 3-minute limit, and needed to get to the surface immediately. She stayed calm and turned the switch again, but still, nothing happened. At this point, a standby diver noticed the sled was not moving and rushed over. He tried to manually inflate the balloon using his own auxiliary air tank, but there was not enough air coming out to fill it quickly. The sled began to move upward, but painfully slowly. You might wonder why the standby diver did not just give Audrey his regulator to let her breathe. But because she was so deep, the immense pressure had compressed her lungs to the size of small oranges. If she took even a tiny gulp of air at that depth, the air would expand so dramatically as she rose that it would have destroyed her lungs and killed her. All Audrey could do was cling to the sled, rise slowly, and try to hold her breath as long as possible. The video shows her remaining absolutely stoic as she rode the sled, knowing what was about to happen. On the surface, when she did not appear after 3 minutes, Pippin put on scuba gear and jumped in. By the time he reached her and brought her out of the water, she had been without air for 8 minutes and 40 seconds. She had a faint pulse when they put her on the boat, but there was no doctor on standby to treat her immediately. Pippin had also spent a few extra minutes trying to resuscitate her while they were still in the water, which delayed medical care. She was rushed to the hospital but was pronounced dead. The cause of death was drowning. While some believed Pippin had intentionally sabotaged the dive to protect his own record, the official investigation concluded that Audrey's death was a tragic accident. In 1993, after an exhaustive review of hundreds of potential sites across the United States, executives from the German car company Mercedes-Benz made a monumental decision. They announced that Tuscaloosa, Alabama, would become the site of their first ever passenger car assembly factory outside of Germany. This was an incredibly historic day, not just for the executives at Mercedes-Benz, but for the entire state of Alabama. At the time, Alabama had one of the highest unemployment rates in the nation, and residents were desperate for stable, well-paying work. They were hopeful that this new factory would create hundreds of jobs and give the local economy a much-needed boost. But what actually happened next far exceeded their wildest expectations. Immediately following the Mercedes-Benz announcement, 3 other major automotive giants, Toyota, Honda, and Hyundai, all made similar announcements. They revealed that they too would be setting up massive manufacturing shops in Alabama. These 4 major factories did not just bring their own assembly line jobs. They also attracted dozens of smaller factories that supplied the parts needed to build the cars. These supplier factories set up operations all across the state, bringing thousands of additional jobs with them. This single decision by Mercedes-Benz in 1993 ended up creating tens of thousands of new jobs all across Alabama, transforming the state into a massive automotive manufacturing hub. 2 years later, in 1995, a little girl named Regina Elsie was born just about an hour away from the Mercedes-Benz factory in Tuscaloosa. Growing up, the automotive manufacturing industry was a constant presence in her life. Many of her family members worked in the local factories, and as a child, she would sit outside and watch dozens of massive 18-wheelers go by. These trucks were always carrying car parts, heading down the highway toward one of the many assembly plants. Regina was a quiet, reserved, and incredibly sweet kid. She absolutely loved to read, she was an excellent student in school, and she had a deep love for animals. She was the kind of person who could not bear to see an animal suffering. Whenever she found a stray dog or cat in her neighborhood, she would immediately take it in and bring it back to her house to care for it. But of all the animals she rescued, her absolute favorite was her dog, whom she named Cow. Regina had big dreams for her future. She wanted to go to college, study medicine, and eventually become a pediatrician so she could help sick children. After she graduated from high school, she took her first step toward that dream. She enrolled in a local community college on a federal grant with plans to eventually transfer to Auburn University to finish her degree and then apply to medical school. But while she was attending community college, her life took a beautiful and unexpected turn. She fell in love with a local boy named Dan. Remarkably, Regina and Dan had actually known each other since kindergarten, but it was not until they were older that they realized they were meant to be together. Before long, the young couple got engaged and started planning their wedding. They were incredibly happy and wanted to take the next step by moving into a place of their own. But they ran into a very common and difficult obstacle. They simply did not have enough money. Regina was a full-time student, so she did not have any income coming in. Dan was working as a shelf stocker at the local Walmart, making barely above minimum wage. They quickly realized that they could not afford rent, utilities, and groceries on Dan's salary alone. The only way they could afford their own home would be if Regina dropped out of college and got a job too. This was an incredibly tough decision for Regina. She still desperately wanted to become a pediatrician, but at the same time, she was so excited about starting her life and her future with Dan. She thought about it long and hard, and she eventually told herself that she was only 20 years old. She figured she could take a break from her education, work for a few years to build up some savings with Dan, and then go back to school later to get her medical degree. So, in January of 2016, Regina made the difficult decision to disenroll from her classes and start looking for a full-time job. A month later, she landed a job as an assembly line worker at a car parts supplier factory called Agent USA, which was located in southeastern Alabama. This was a factory where her stepfather and one of her sisters were currently employed, and the company supplied parts directly to major car brands like Hyundai and Kia. When Regina told her mother about the new job, her mother was deeply concerned. Her mother had worked at 2 other similar auto parts supplier factories in the past, and she knew firsthand how brutal the environment could be. She warned Regina that it was not a great place to work, explaining that the physical pace was exhausting and the pressure to perform was almost unbearable. You see, car parts suppliers operate under an intense amount of stress. They have strict daily quotas that they must meet for their major clients. If they fail to deliver the required number of parts, even by a tiny margin, they can be hit with massive financial fines from companies like Hyundai and Kia. This immense pressure from the top often filters down to the factory floor, leading management to overwork their employees. Over time, the workers develop a production at all costs mentality. They see that their employers care far more about hitting numbers than anything else, and as a result, they start cutting corners and ignoring safety regulations just to keep the assembly lines moving. But when Regina's mother shared these warnings, Regina listened but insisted that she had no choice. She had bills to pay, and she was determined to build a life with Dan. By this time, she and Dan had moved into a small house in southeastern Alabama, not far from the Agent USA factory. They were living there happily with their beloved dog, Cow. Regina had also bought herself a brand new car, which she was incredibly proud of because she had paid for it with her own hard work. She had also gone shopping and found the absolute perfect wedding dress for her upcoming big day. It fit her beautifully and made her feel like a princess, but it cost $4,000. Because of all of these expenses, Regina was not about to walk away from this job. She needed the money to pay for her car, her rent, and her dream wedding dress. When she first started working at Agent USA, the company put her on temporary status, which meant she was only making $8.75 an hour. In order to make more money and help secure her future, she needed the company to transition her to full-time status. Becoming a full-time employee came with a wage increase of $1.75 per hour, which would make a huge difference for her and Dan. Regina was determined to prove to the management that she was a hard worker and deserved that full-time promotion. To show her dedication, she volunteered to work exhausting 12-hour shifts 7 days a week. For 6 months, she worked this punishing schedule, pushing her body and mind to the absolute limit. But by June of 2016, the constant exhaustion had finally caught up with her. She was completely over it. She drove to her parents' house, collapsed onto their couch, and tiredly told them that she just could not keep doing this anymore. She explained that she was going to start looking for other work, hopefully something part-time, so she could finally go back to school and resume her dream of becoming a pediatrician. Her family was incredibly relieved and excited to hear this, looking forward to seeing Regina get her normal life back. A few days later, on June 18, 2016, Regina went in to work what would be her final shifts at Agent USA. She was scheduled for the day shift, and her specific job that afternoon was to oversee a large automated robot. This robot's task was to weld metal pillars onto the front right and front left sides of car frames, which is where the side view mirrors are attached. The robot was a massive machine looking like a giant, powerful arm protruding from the concrete floor. At the very end of this robotic arm, where a hand would normally be, were 2 sharp welding tips that stuck out about 4 inches each. Because these automated arms move with incredible speed and force, the robot was surrounded by a tall, heavy chain-link safety fence. This cage was there for one reason: to prevent employees from getting anywhere near the machine while it was in operation. Regina's job was to monitor the robot's performance from a safe distance using a computer screen located outside of the metal cage. At some point during the afternoon, as Regina was watching her computer screen, an error message popped up. It indicated that there was a stud fault on Robot 23. Now, Robot 23 was not the machine that Regina was personally responsible for. It was the robot located right next to her station. But the person in charge of monitoring Robot 23 was a member of Regina's immediate work team. Because the entire team shared a single collective quota that they had to hit by the end of the shift, having Robot 23 shut down was a massive problem for everyone, including Regina. If the line stopped, their numbers would drop, and management would be furious. So Regina stepped away from her station and walked over to the safety cage of Robot 23. She spoke to her coworker, and they both agreed that the best course of action was to call the maintenance department and have them come over to clear the error code. A security camera inside the factory was pointing down at Regina's work area, capturing her and her coworkers as they stood outside the metal cage of Robot 23, waiting for help to arrive. But as the minutes ticked by, no one from the maintenance department showed up. It was clear from the security footage that the workers were becoming increasingly anxious. They knew that every single second the robot remained idle, they were falling further behind on their quota. They knew that failing to hit their numbers would result in severe reprimands from management and massive fines for the company. The pressure was building, and the stress was getting to them. At some point, Regina apparently decided that she could not wait any longer. She decided to take matters into her own hands and fix the issue herself. She picked up a small tool that looked like a screwdriver, walked over to the safety cage of Robot 23, opened the door, and stepped inside. She walked directly up to the main stem of the stationary robot. As she did, she turned her back to the massive robotic arm that was positioned right behind her. She leaned in and began using her small tool to work on the stem, trying to manually clear the fault. Whatever adjustment she made, it worked. But it worked too well. The moment she cleared the issue, the machine's computer registered that the fault was gone, and the automated system immediately triggered the robot to resume its task. The massive robotic arm behind Regina instantly sprang to life. It swept forward with incredible speed and force, performing the exact motion it had been trying to complete before it aired out. As the arm swung forward, those two 4-inch metal welding tips at the end of the arm were driven directly into Regina's upper back. The force of the impact was devastating. Her coworkers, who were standing just outside the cage, saw the horrific event happen in real time. One of them immediately lunged for the emergency shutoff switch and pressed it down. But the system did not cut power instantly. Before the robot completely shut down, the momentum of the arm thrust Regina all the way across the inside of the safety cage, pinning her violently against the metal wall. When the machine finally lost power and came to a complete stop, the two welding tips were still fully embedded in her upper back, holding her upright against the wall. She was literally pinned to the wall, suspended off the ground. It was a scene of absolute horror. Regina was conscious, and her eyes were wide open, but she did not make a single sound. She was in a state of profound shock and could not speak or scream. Her coworkers panicked, rushing to the cage door, but none of them knew how to manually release the robot's powerful mechanical grip without causing further injury or turning the machine back on. The team leader realized they needed help immediately. He ran out of the area, hopped onto a nearby forklift, and sped across the busy factory floor toward the break room. He burst through the doors, located a maintenance worker, and told him there was a terrible emergency. He dragged the maintenance worker out, but because they needed to get back as fast as possible, the maintenance worker had to sit on the team leader's lap as they sped back across the factory on the forklift. When they arrived back at the safety cage of Robot 23, the team leader pushed the maintenance worker toward the open cage door, telling him to get Regina down. But the situation immediately deteriorated. The maintenance worker did not speak any English. He was completely terrified by the horrific scene before him, seeing Regina pinned to the wall. He did not understand the frantic instructions the workers were shouting at him, and he had no idea how to safely disengage the robot under these extreme circumstances. As the seconds ticked by, tempers flared, and the panicked workers began shouting at him in frustration. Overwhelmed by the chaos, the fear, and the pressure of the moment, the maintenance worker simply turned around and ran away, leaving the workers on their own. By the time emergency medical crews finally arrived at the factory several minutes later, Regina was still pinned to the wall by the robot. She was still conscious, her eyes were still open, and she remained completely hauntingly silent. The paramedics and rescue workers were eventually able to carefully disengage the robotic arm and lower Regina to the ground. They rushed her to a local hospital, and due to the extreme nature of her injuries, she was quickly transferred to a major trauma center. But despite the best efforts of the medical staff, the damage done to her body by the metal welding tips was simply too severe. Regina died at the hospital, surrounded by her devastated family. An investigation into the tragedy was immediately launched by safety regulators, and what they uncovered was deeply disturbing. It was revealed that Agent USA had failed to properly train Regina or any of her coworkers on basic machine safety protocols. The company's unofficial policy was to hire temporary workers and get them onto the active factory floor as quickly as possible to keep production numbers up. Because of this rush, Regina and her team members had never been taught the vital lockout procedure. This is a standard safety protocol where, before anyone enters a robot safety cage, the power supply must be physically locked in the off position with a padlock. This ensures that even if a fault is cleared, the machine cannot accidentally turn back on while a human is inside the cage. Regina and her coworkers were completely unaware of this life-saving rule. All they had been taught was that the daily quota was the absolute most important thing and that failing to hit it would have severe consequences. This high-pressure environment is what drove Regina to enter that cage, and it is ultimately what led to her death. Following her tragic passing, the state and federal safety agencies issued severe citations to the company. Agent USA ultimately pleaded guilty to failing to provide a safe working environment and failing to properly train their employees, which directly resulted in Regina's death. As part of the legal resolution, the company was ordered to pay a settlement of $1.5 million to Regina's grieving family. But no amount of money could ever make up for the loss of a bright, kind-hearted 20-year-old girl who had her entire life ahead of her. Her family was left to mourn the loss of a beloved daughter, sister, and fiancé, and her dog Cal was left waiting for an owner who would never come home. It is truly sobering to think about how quickly an ordinary, routine day can turn into a tragic fight for survival. Robert was just trying to clean up his backyard, hoping to enjoy his hard-earned retirement in peace, completely unaware of the fragile earth beneath his feet. Audrey was chasing her dream of becoming the absolute best in her sport, placing her trust in a team and equipment that ultimately failed her in her most critical hour. And Regina was just trying to build a beautiful life with her fiancé, working herself to the bone in a high-stress factory, only to be failed by the very company that was supposed to keep her safe. Their stories serve as a powerful and tragic reminder of how fragile life can be and how quickly the places we go can become traps from which there is no escape. And the terrifying part is, none of these people thought they were doing anything dangerous that day. They all believed they were completely safe right up until the moment everything went wrong. If you want more true stories like these, check out the next video on screen now.